Chapter 9:26. Behind her, Qin Feng answered, "Exterminate the entire clan." Yili shook her head and smiled. The emperor and the imperial family are also part of King Li's clan. Exterminating the entire clan is impossible. However, exterminating the entire clan is inevitable, right? Yungo asked in confusion. Didn't they say that King Li is Xiaoyan's father? Yili smiled and patted Yunji's head. That's right. Then it's confusing the imperial family's bloodline? King Li passed a son off as the late emperor's son. How should he be punished? Xian Zhao Dowager Consort? Xian Zhao Dowager Consort was at a loss for words. How was this Mo Jingli passing off his son as the late emperor's son? It was clearly the late emperor who took away Mo Jingli's newborn son and passed him off as a prince to raise him. However, who would believe such words? The late emperor had quite a number of princes. Moreover, he passed the throne to this child in the end. After a long time of speechlessness, Xian Zhao Dowager Consort finally said coldly, "This is Maida Chu State's matter. It seems to have nothing to do with Princess Ding." Yili was not in a hurry. She pointed at Ying on the ground and said, "If this is my fourth sister's child, does Xian Zhao Dowager Consort still think it has nothing to do with me? Or does Xian Zhao Dowager Consort think that I and the Prince Ding mansion are easy to bully?"
Sophistry.
Xian Zhao Dowager Consort could not win against Yili in a war of words. She swung her sleeves and sat to the side without saying another word. Yili walked to Yi Ying's side and squatted down, asking softly, "How is it?" Yunge shook her head sadly. Yi Ying was hit by Mo Jingli's palm, and her internal injuries were severe. Her meridians were broken, and after that, she fell down the stairs and aggravated her internal injuries. No matter how good the internal injury medicine was, it could only delay the time. Ying leaned in Yunji's arms and reached out to Mo Suyun with difficulty. Seeing the bloodstains on her clothes and the traces of blood flowing from her lips, Mo Suyun was frightened and did not dare to go forward. Yili sighed and pulled Mo Suyun over. She whispered, "Suyun, go and take a look at her. She won't hurt you." Mo Suyun seemed to have an almost instinctive trust in Yili. He looked at Yili hesitantly before he finally walked slowly towards Ying. Ying looked at Mo Suyun with a smile, and sparkling tears kept falling from the corners of her eyes. "Suyun, it's all Mother's fault. If Mother hadn't been greedy, you wouldn't have fallen so ill. Ahem, from now on, be good and stay by your aunt's side. She will settle you down. In the future, you won't have to be so scared anymore. You have to live well, live well." Third sister. Yili walked up to her and sighed. "Why are you doing this?" Ying smiled and said, "I'm not sad. Mo Jingli didn't want my Suyun. Then he shouldn't have any children in this life. Ha, the late emperor did a good deed. People like Mo Jingli deserve to die without any descendants." Third sister, "I was ignorant back then. Please don't blame me. Please take good care of Suyun." Yili was silent for a moment and nodded. "Don't worry, I will settle this child down. Mr. Xinyang is also in Glass City. He might be able to cure his body in the future." Ying nodded and smiled with tears in her eyes. "Third sister, I've always known that you are a good person. I've always been jealous of you. Is it true that only good people can get happiness? I really envy you. In my next life, I'll be a good person too." Yili was speechless. In fact, compared to many people, the selfish and weak Ying was really not a bad person. At least she had never really harmed anyone, although it might be because she didn't have the ability. "Ying, you bitch. I'm going to kill you." As they were talking, Mo Jingli suddenly rushed out from inside. His ashen face was twisted and ferocious like an evil spirit. Mo Suyun, who was still being pulled by Yili to talk, was immediately frightened and threw himself into Yili's arms. Mo Jingli grabbed Yi Ying's clothes and tried to pull her up. Yungo, who had been ignored by the side, was instantly furious. Yunji's mood was not very good to begin with. She could not cure the first patient after leaving the mountain and could not save the second patient. However, this Princely was actually dragging a dying person around like a sack in front of her. "Let go of me." In a fit of anger, Yunge unceremoniously slapped him. Mo Jingli realized that he was not a match for this little girl in front of him. He immediately used Ying to block in front of him without hesitation. Fortunately, Yunge had a peaceful nature. Even when she slapped him in anger, she did not use her full strength. She stared angrily at Mo Jingli in front of her. Shameless. Bad guy.
Bastard. Scum.
Yi Li's mouth twitched. She silently thought about who was the one who taught Yunge bad things these days. Ying did not care about her current situation. With a faint smile on her lips, she looked at Mo Jingli and smiled. Prince, do you like the gift that Immerse gave you?
Bitch.
Take out the antidote. Mo Jingli said coldly. Ying struggled to pick up the knife in her other hand. She smiled. The antidote. I ate the antidote. Prince, do you know how much effort I put in to get this medicine? I did not plan to let you use it so quickly, but I prepared it long ago. In Glass City. After knowing that you already got the antidote, I thought of a way to make this medicine. Since this morning, I have been soaking this dagger in the medicine. Then, before I came in, I ate the antidote myself. Bitch, I'm going to kill you. Mo Jingli choked Ying's neck tightly. He really underestimated Ying, this bitch. She had actually started scheming so long ago. Ying turned her head with some difficulty to look at Mo Jingli, who was hiding in Yi Li's arms. She raised the knife in her hand and stabbed at Mo Jingli. This stab was not meant to hurt him. It was meant to be an assassin. Mo Jingli shook Ying off. Ying did not care. She looked up at Mo Suyun. Suyun, leave this place with your aunt, otherwise he will kill you. Seeing more and more blood flowing from Ying's lips, everyone was silent. They silently watched the woman lying in a pool of blood gradually lose her life. Mother, in the quiet palace, a weak child's voice suddenly sounded. Yunge, who was standing beside Yi Li, suddenly covered her eyes and cried silently. Yaoji, who was sitting beside Mu Yang, lowered her head and silently wiped a tear from the corner of her eye. Her bright eyes became more determined. Yi Li handed Mo Suyun to Wei Lin, who was behind her. She said lightly, Yunge, we should go back. Yunge silently sniffed. She walked over and held Yi Li's clothes and followed her out. I believe Prince Li will make good arrangements for a fourth sister's body. Yi Li looked back at Mo Jingli and asked, Arrangements? Mo Jingli showed a strange and twisted smile. I want to burn her bones and scatter her ashes. Up to you. Yi Li did not have any thoughts of burying her. It would be good if they could bring Yi Ying's body out, but they had no way to do so now. This consort will help the prince publicize the great kindness of Princess Consort Li. I believe the people of Jiangnan will be grateful for Prince Li's kindness. Chapter 9:27. Yi Li, stop right there. Mo Jingli angrily roared. Leave Mo Suyun behind for me. Don't even think about it. Before Yi Li could say anything, Yunge angrily said, Xiaoyun's mother has already entrusted him to Li Jiejie. And if you didn't want to kill Xiaoyun, how could Princess Consort Li have died? He is the emperor of the Dechu state. Mo Jingli gritted his teeth. He might even be his only son from now on. Yi Ying's final attack had dealt a huge blow to Mo Jingli. He had been poisoned twice. The imperial physician had already said that even if the antidote was found, his chances of having children in the future were very slim. Yi Li turned around and calmly said, Doesn't Li King want to get rid of this child and ascend the throne? Then in exchange, this consort will take this child away. From now on, he will no longer be a descendant of the Mo family. Just as Li King wished, Mo Suyun has passed away.
No.
Mo Jingli flatly refused. Yi Li did not care, then. Mo Suyun is still the emperor, but his birth mother entrusted him to this consort. Then this consort, and the Prince Ding mansion must ensure that he lives up to his name as the emperor. In other words, the Prince Ding mansion would completely interfere with the politics of the Dechu state. Not to mention that Mo Jingli was absolutely unwilling to let the Prince Ding mansion interfere with the Dechu state. Even if he agreed, Mo Suyun was still in a daze. He was not truly stupid. If he was really stupid, he would not have called out Mother Burlier. When he grew up in the future, he would definitely not stand on Emo Jingli's side as his father. Yili looked at him and said, "You can't have your cake and eat it too. Li King had best consider this carefully." Emo Jingli darkly said, "What if I insist that all of you stay?" Yili smiled faintly and said, "That will depend on whether King Li has the ability or not. Even if King Li wants to keep all of us here, it would be best to ensure that no one else will spread the news of what happened tonight." Prince Li killed his son and the emperor, and the princess consort sacrificed herself for the greater good. What a good show. Emo Jingli was already heavily injured, and now that he was so anxious that his vision turned black, he almost fell to the ground. The people next to him hurriedly helped him to a chair. Emo Jingli held onto the armrest and forcefully suppressed the anger in his heart. He took a deep breath and stared at Yili. He said in a deep voice, "Yili, good job." "Not as good as Prince Li," Yili retorted calmly. The virtuous consort looked at Emo Jingli's exhausted appearance and hurriedly said, "Princess Ding, put down the emperor. I promise you all will leave Jiangnan safely." On the side, Qin Feng gave a disdainful laugh and said, "Do we need your promise? Nanjing is just a place where we can come and go as we please. What can you do to us?" The virtuous consort's face darkened. Yili spoke first and leisurely said, "I have always kept my word. Since I promised fourth sister to take care of the child, I must take the child away. Virtuous consort, you can try to see if it is better for us to leave quietly or for us to kill our way out of the Li Palace. With just the few of you?" The virtuous consort sneered. Yili smiled and said, "Do you have a lot of people?" Virtuous consort, why don't you try to summon the guards to see? The virtuous consort didn't speak. Yili dared to say this because there probably weren't many guards in the Li Palace that could move. "Prince Li, what do you think?" Yili asked.
Get out.
Emo Jingli finally roared. Yili didn't care about what he said. She waved her hand and led everyone out in broad daylight. In the main hall, the atmosphere was so solemn and silent that one could hear a pin drop clearly. Everyone looked down and could only hear the thumping of their hearts. Emo Jingli sat in the main hall, gasping for breath. His eyes were as ferocious as a beast that chose people to devour. They had originally planned to compliment their future master, but the grand banquet had turned into a melodramatic, bloody, and tragic drama of the royal family's ethics. How could the people sitting here not be scared witless? They could only secretly rejoice in their hearts. At least there were so many of them. The prince wouldn't kill all of them, right? The so-called law can't punish the masses. There was some truth to it. Reporting to the prince, Princess Ding and her people disappeared shortly after leaving the palace. After a long time, someone outside the door reported, "A bunch of trash. Get out of here. I want all of you to get out. Get out." Emo Jingli roared. If everyone didn't leave now, when would they leave? They quickly got up and said goodbye to Emo Jingli and Xian Zhao Old Concubine and hurried out. Xian Zhao Old Concubine glanced at Emo Jingli and called softly, "Get out! Get out!" Emo Jingli didn't look at the people in front of him and scolded angrily. In the small courtyard where Yi Li and others were temporarily staying, Su Qingchen looked at the child in Wei Lin's arms and raised her eyebrows. "Emo Jingli saw through your identity." Yi Li helplessly smiled and said, "It doesn't matter. He doesn't have the time to do anything to us now. But big brother, the things in Nanjing are almost done. We should go back." Although Emo Jingli might not dare to do anything to them for the time being, it was inevitable that they would provoke him if they stayed in the city for too long. Maybe Emo Jingli would impulsively fight to the death. Emo Jingli doesn't seem to be that kind of impulsive person, Su Qingchen said. It was not that Emo Jingli's character was calm, but Emo Jingli was too attached to those flashy power. It was hard for people who were attached to their loved ones to be reckless when they did things. It's very likely that he is one now. Any man who is unlucky like Emo Jingli would probably do whatever it took. If he didn't get it in the beginning, it would be fine. But now his poison had been cured, and he obviously had another child. In the blink of an eye, the child was gone, and he was poisoned. In the future, his only hope was probably broken. It had to be said that Yi Ying's last incident really made people look at her with admiration. Su Qingchen sighed softly and glanced at Imo Suyun, who was lying motionless in Wei Lin's arms. Yi Ying is dead. What are you going to do with this child? After all, he is the emperor of De Chu State. It is not appropriate to raise him in the Prince Ding mansion. Yi Li said, Ying wants us to send the child back to my father. After all, he is their grandson. There is the Prince Ding mansion in Glass City to take care of him. The child should be fine. In any case, it is better than staying in Nanjing as a puppet emperor. Su Qingchen nodded and said, Well, you can go north tomorrow morning. Hearing this, Yi Li was stunned. Big brother, do you still have something to do? Su Qingchen said, I still have to help Yun go find someone. Yi Li frowned and thought for a while. If you want to find someone, can't big brother just tell me? Is it difficult to find them? Su Qingchen shook his head and smiled. It's not difficult to find them. I know where they live. But I have to take Yunge there. Yi Li looked at Su Qingchen awkwardly and said, Why don't we wait for 2 days and go back with big brother? Yi Li was really worried about letting Su Qingchen take Yunge and stay in Nanjing City. Su Qingchen did not have the strength to trust a chicken. Yun Ji's martial arts were not weak, but she was a little girl without any experience. What if something happened to big brother? Chapter 928. Looking at Yi Li's undisguised worry, Su Qingchen smiled helplessly. Li this is really just an accident. Prince Ding must be waiting anxiously. You'd better go back quickly. Otherwise, he will complain that I'm not capable enough to keep you in Jiangnan for so long. Yi Li was determined to ignore Su Qingchen. I'll stay for 1 more day. Anyway, there are still some things to deal with. I'm not in a hurry. Unable to persuade Yi Li, Su Qingchen could only plan to take Yunge to find her tomorrow morning. Yi Li was worried about him staying in Nanjing alone. How could he not be worried about Yi Li's safety? In the end, Nanjing was not their territory. Princess, Master Qingchen, Miss Yunge, and the girl in the backyard are fighting. A guard flew in and reported with a worried face. Yi Li and Su Qingchen were both stunned. Su Qingchen immediately stood up. Yi Li was not very worried. Not to mention that Dong Fongyu's internal energy was restrained. Even if Yunge was fine, she might not be at a disadvantage. Dong Fongyu's internal energy is gone. How can she still make a fuss? Yi Li asked curiously. The guard frowned and said, Princess, they didn't use martial arts. How can they fight without martial arts? Princess, you'll know when you see it. The guard said. Martial arts was not the only way to fight. Because most people in the world did not know martial arts, it did not mean that they did not fight. Therefore, when Yi Li and Su Qingchen saw the 2 people fighting on the ground in the courtyard, they could not help but be stunned. Su Qingchen could not help but touch his forehead and called out, Yunge. Hearing Su Qingchen's voice, Yunge paused. But this pause was enough for Dong Fengyu to grab her beautiful face. If he grabbed her face, even if Dong Fengyu did not have internal energy, Yun Ji's beautiful face would be disfigured for several months. However, although Dong Fengyu did not have any internal energy at the moment, it did not mean that Yunge did not either. So, she just tilted her head back and clasped Dong Fengyu's claws tightly with one hand. Don't fight, okay? Dong Fengyu sneered. Go to hell. With a bitter face, Yunge blocked Dong Fengyu's hand that was waving at her again. She quickly sealed her acupoints and jumped up from the ground, running to Su Qingchen. Su Qingchen, sisterly, why are you here? Yi Li raised her eyebrows at her, smiling without saying a word. Su Qingchen looked at her. Who told you to fight with someone? Although Su Qingchen's voice was as gentle as ever, Yunge felt an inexplicable chill run down his spine. She couldn't help but shrink her neck and move closer to Yi Li. She felt that Su Qingchen, who was looking at her indifferently, was fiercer than her father, who had passed away 3 or 4 years ago. Therefore, it was not unreasonable for the brothers of the Su family to be afraid of eldest young Master Su. Eldest young Master Su was born with the dignity of a teacher. I was wrong. Yunge lowered her head and admitted her mistake. Yili looked at the two with a smile, and then looked at Dongfangyu, who was fixed on one side. She smiled faintly and said, "Why did Yunge come here?" This yard was the innermost and most remote yard in the mansion. Ordinary people would not come here for no reason. Yunge said with a bitter face, "I just wanted to pick a few flowers for little Yun." It turned out that there were 2 begonias in the yard where Dongfangyu lived. Yunge thought that Immerse Suyun had been frightened, and his mind was somewhat blank. Perhaps it would be better to give him some fun things. But the little girl who grew up in the mountains did not know what to give. Her first choice was naturally flowers and plants. So she ran all over the mansion and found these 2 begonias that were blooming well. But she did not want to disturb Dongfangyu, who was under house arrest in the yard. And Dongfangyu had heard the people in the mansion mention this girl that young Master Qingchen had brought back personally. So they started to fight as soon as they met. If Dongfangyu's internal energy had not been restrained, she might have used her killing move directly. Su Qingchen handed over a white handkerchief and said, "Don't you know martial arts? Do you need to roll around on the ground with people?" Yunge lowered her head and drew circles on the ground with her feet. She thought that Dongfangyu did not know martial arts. People who practiced martial arts naturally could not bully ordinary people who did not know martial arts. After seeing Su Qingchen, Dongfangyu no longer stared at Yunge with her eyes. Instead, she looked at Su Qingchen with infatuation. Ever since she was caught by Yili, she had not seen Su Qingchen even once. Although Yili did not lock her up in the dungeon, as long as she wanted to take a step out of the courtyard, she would immediately be stopped. And these people did not use any tricks. Even when she shouted that she wanted to burn the house, they did not even turn their eyes. The meaning was obvious. If she wanted to burn herself to death, she could do so. Of course, Dongfangyu did not want to burn herself to death, so she could only endure silently. Today, she finally saw Su Qingchen in person. Dongfangyu was not in the mood to argue with Yunge. Yunge looked curiously at Su Qingchen and then at Dongfangyu. She could not help but move closer to Yili. She felt that the way this woman looked at Su Qingchen was very strange. It made her hair stand on end. "Master Qingchen, how are you?" Dongfangyu asked softly. She did not care that her acupoints were sealed and her body was stiff. It was hard for people to get used to saying such tender words. Su Qingchen looked indifferently at Dongfangyu, then turned her gaze to Yunge, who was beside Yili, and said, "Why aren't you going back to change? Then, copy the essay I taught you yesterday 10 times and give it to me tomorrow morning." Yun Ji's face fell. "Su Qingchen, I don't. 15 chapters. Su Qingchen said indifferently. Yunge stared blankly at Su Qingchen. She opened her mouth and finally said, "I'll go right now." She looked carefully at Su Qingchen. She probably felt that Su Qingchen was not in a good mood. Yunge asked in a low voice, "Can I plant a few flowers before I go?" Su Qingchen nodded. Yunge then flew up to a branch and planted a few flowers. She ran out quickly, as if Su Qingchen would add 10 or 20 more times if she stayed. Looking at her departing figure, Yili couldn't help but smile and said, "Big brother, you're too strict with Yunge. Look at how scared she is. Yunge is your savior after all." Su Qingchen glanced indifferently at Yili. She is not young. She has lived alone in the mountains. When her father was alive, he did not teach her many things that should have been taught. Yili suddenly understood. She nodded and said, "That's right. 15 years old is not young. It's time for her to get married. If she comes back with us, please teach her well, Andy." Su Qingchen did not comment. She said indifferently, "I'm afraid she won't go with us." At that time, a rich and powerful family, Yunge, who grew up in the countryside, would be eaten up by others. Yili said with a smile, "Big brother must have a way to let her go back with us." Chapter 929. Su Qingchen didn't seem to hear her. She turned and walked out of the door. Yili glanced coldly at Dongfangyu, who was sitting on the ground, and said, "Miss Dongfang, after being a prisoner, you still don't know what it means to know your place." Dongfangyu finally stopped staring at Su Qingchen's back. She stared at Yili angrily and said, "Who is that girl?" Yili raised her eyebrows and smiled. If Miss Dongfang doesn't know who Yunj is, why would you fight with her? Dongfang screamed. That's impossible. How can that wild girl who doesn't know anything be worthy of young Master Qingchen? You lied to me. Yili, how did I offend you? Why do you have to break me up with young Master Qingchen? Yili looked up and rolled her eyes. Dongfang was crazy. Miss Dongfang, what do you mean I want to break you up with young Master Qingchen? Did my brother even look at you? Yili suddenly felt that she had been wronged. She was a good sister who cared about her big brother's lifelong happiness. She was definitely not picky. She was the best sister-in-law in the world. It must be you. Otherwise, young Master Qingchen wouldn't dislike me. Dongfang said angrily. Miss Dongfang, you think too much. Yili said calmly, look at how big brother treats Yunj, and then look at how big brother treats you. Don't you know what kind of girl he likes? Dongfang glared fiercely at Yili. Yili blinked her eyes and smiled faintly. Miss Dongfang, if I were you, I would rather think about how many days I have left than think about all this nonsense. You want to kill me? Dongfang looked at her coldly and said disdainfully. Yili shook her head and said, I don't plan to kill you. In fact, I plan to let you go. You think I'll believe you? Dongfang sneered. Yili said sincerely, it's true. I plan to let you go. And I'll send you back to your original subordinates in the Boundless Mountain, along with the evidence of you murdering Dongfang Hui. Hearing Yili's words, Dongfang Yu's face instantly turned pale. Murdering Dongfang Hui was the only thing she had done in her life that she couldn't escape condemnation. At the same time, it was also something that would definitely cost her life if word got out. While not even a tenth of Infinite Boundless Mountain's power remained, there were still quite a few people who were loyal to Infinite Boundless Mountain. These people were loyal to her because she was the young master of the Boundless Mountain, to be the successor to Dongfang Hui. Once people found out that she was the one who killed Dongfang Hui, those people would immediately turn against her to avenge Dongfang Hui. Dongfang still had self-awareness. How could his mere few months compare to Dongfang Hui's decades of prestige? Looking at Dongfang bleak expression, Yili did not have the slightest bit of sympathy for her. To her, Dongfang Hui was an enemy. But to Dongfang Hui was her master, her mother, and her savior. If it weren't for Dongfang Hui, Dongfang would have died long ago. She wouldn't have boasted that she was proficient in the 4 arts, martial arts, and medicine. She was the only one in the world who was worthy of young Master Qingchen. Even if Dongfang Hui had wronged everyone in the world, she hadn't wronged Dongfang. She betrayed her master and even sent people to assassinate Dongfang Hui just because Dongfang Hui stood in her way. She was no different from a beast. Su Qingchen didn't like her. Even if Su Qingchen liked her, he would kill her. Of course, young Master Qingchen's vision was much sharper than Yili's. Originally, Yili hadn't thought of how to deal with Dongfang. There was no point in keeping such a person alive. It just so happened that many hidden powers of the Boundless Mountain were hard to find. Once Yili released the truth of Dongfang Hui's murder, there were immediately people who were loyal to Dongfang Hui, disloyal to Dongfang, and secretly ambitious people who wanted to form their own power. Therefore, Yili naturally didn't object to using Dongfang in exchange for some benefits. Of course, this had to ensure that Dongfang didn't survive. Dongfang's obsession with Su Qingchen had long been twisted. If she escaped, Yili couldn't guarantee what she would do. Because they planned to go north as soon as possible, Su Qingchen didn't delay any longer. The next morning, he brought Yunge to the house of Marquis Muyang. Hearing the news of young Master Qingchen's visit, Muyang and his father's faces turned ugly. If it was in the past, they would naturally welcome young Master Qingchen's visit.
But now,
Prince Li had just been screwed over by the Prince Ding mansion. Of course, this wasn't the fault of the Prince Ding mansion. But no one in power wouldn't be angry. At this time, although Prince Li didn't send people to do anything to Princess Ding and young Master Qingchen, it was because he didn't have the confidence to catch them all. It wasn't that he didn't want to. Now that they were too close to young Master Qingchen, weren't they rushing to let Prince Li vent his anger? However, young Master Qingchen was not someone who they could ignore whenever they wanted to see him. With Su Qingchen's fame and status, you might not be able to see him when you wanted to. But when he wanted to see you, you definitely couldn't refuse to see him. Young Master Qingchen came from afar. This old man didn't welcome you properly.
It was really rude of me.
Old Marquis Muyang led Muyang and the Mu family to welcome Su Qingchen with a face full of smiles. Su Qingchen glanced at the group of people behind Marquis Muyang with a faint smile. It was said that Marquis Muyang was Mo Jingqi's confidant. Now that Mo Jingqi's reputation had fallen and his family was ruined, but Marquis Muyang's family was still prosperous and even more powerful than before. He was indeed a rare person among the generals who knew how to monopolize. Frowning slightly, Su Qingchen glanced at Yun Ge. Was it really a good thing to leave Yun Ge in the house of Marquis Muyang? Even if Yaoji was here, Yaoji had a heavy responsibility. How could she have the time to take care of an ignorant child? Besides, how long could the house of Marquis Muyang last? Yun Ge followed beside Su Qingchen and looked strangely at the old man who was talking to Su Qingchen. Since he felt that he didn't welcome them properly, why didn't he just go out to welcome them? Even if he was older, it didn't matter if he didn't welcome them. Yun Ge frowned. She didn't know why, but intuitively, she didn't like this old man who was smiling amiably at Su Qingchen. Old Marquis Muyang naturally also saw the young girl standing beside Su Qingchen. He felt it was strange. Young Master Qingchen was famous for being disrespectful to women. He was already over the age of 30, but hadn't gotten married. Why would he be with a beautiful young girl? Mu Yang and Yaoji naturally met Yun Ge before. Yaoji had a good impression of this young girl who was skilled in martial arts and nodded at her with a smile. Yun Ge blinked her eyes and smiled sweetly at Yaoji. Although Yun Ge hated those people at the banquet last night, she didn't hold a grudge. Besides, what happened last night had nothing to do with them. It was all that heartless Prince Li's fault. Yaoji, do you know this young girl? Marquis Muyang's wife, who was standing behind Mu Yang and beside Yaoji, suddenly asked in a sharp voice. Old Marquis Muyang frowned. He was very dissatisfied with his daughter-in-law's rude behavior, but he also glanced at Yaoji. Mu Yang glared at his wife and made an excuse. Father, I saw this young girl at Prince Li's mansion last night. Prince Li's mansion? Old Marquis Muyang frowned. What happened at Prince Li's mansion last night? Muyang only said a few words vaguely. As an official, he naturally needed to understand that some things could be said, and some things could not be said even to the people closest to him. Old Marquis Muyang didn't know what happened at Prince Li's mansion last night, but from the news of the Emperor's critical condition and Princess Consort Li's death this morning, it was probably not a small matter. Old Marquis Muyang glanced at Su Qingchen vigilantly and said in a deep voice, "May I know why young Master Qingchen is here?" Su Qingchen smiled faintly. Marquis Muyang, are you going to talk to me here? If possible. Old Marquis Muyang really wanted to talk here. But at the same time, he also understood that this was not the place to talk. He smiled awkwardly and turned to the side. Young master, please come in. After entering the hall and taking a seat, Yun Ge sat obediently next to Su Qingchen. She was so quiet and well-behaved that one couldn't tell that she was the innocent and lively girl who was filled with righteous indignation over someone else's matter last night. After the tea was served, Muyang asked, "Young Master Qingchen, may I know who this young girl is?" Su Qingchen put down the teacup and glanced at Yun Ge, saying indifferently, "May I know if Marquis Muyang remembers a doctor called Shinfengru?" Shinfengru? Muyang frowned in confusion and looked at his parents. Old Marquis Muyang's expression changed slightly. He quickly glanced at Yun Ge, who was sitting beside Su Qingchen, and said in a deep voice, "This old man has never heard of him. May I know why young Master Qingchen is asking about this?" Su Qingchen said, "Then, about 3 to 4 years ago, Marquis Muyang should not have received a single letter from this Mr. Shin." Old Marquis Muyang's expression had returned to normal. He nodded and said, "This old man has indeed not received any letters. If that's the case, this one will take his leave." Su Qingchen's expression darkened and did not say anything else. He stood up and said to Yun Ge, "Yun Ge, let's go." Yun Ge looked at Su Qingchen in confusion. She did not understand why he was suddenly unhappy. However, if Su Qingchen was unhappy, she would usually be the unlucky one. So she quickly stood up and walked to Su Qingchen's side. She hesitated for a moment before asking, "But didn't you say you would help me find someone? Is it because you can't find him?" "It's okay, there's no need to rush." Su Qingchen smiled faintly and looked at Yunge, saying, "There's no need to find him. The person your father arranged can't come and pick you up." Why? Yunge did not understand. Their entire family is already dead. Su Qingchen walked out without looking back. He completely did not see old Marquis Muyang's expression turn ugly, as if he had swallowed a fly. She had never seen Su Qingchen so rude. Yunge nodded apologetically at Marquis Muyang, who was so angry that his face turned green. She quickly chased after him. "Su Qingchen, don't be angry. It's not their fault that they died early. I can do it by myself.
Don't worry.
You'll come with me to Glass City in the future. Are you afraid that the Prince Ding mansion can't support a little girl like you?" Su Qingchen's voice came faintly, with a hint of joy. "I'm not a little girl. Then, do I have to go visit the grave? It's just that my father said that for the next 3 years, I have to visit his grave every year on the anniversary of his death. Otherwise, he'll be angry." "There's no need. Wait until they're all dead," Su Qingchen said faintly. "But didn't you say that they're all dead?" Yunge glared at him angrily. "I said there's no need. Do you understand?" Su Qingchen stopped and looked at Yunge with a gentle smile. Yunge immediately shrunk her head. She lowered her head and said softly, "I understand." Su Qingchen was getting fiercer. Sob sob. Chapter 930. After leaving Marquis Muyang's residence, Yunge was carefully sizing up Su Qingchen as she walked back. She didn't know why, but every time Su Qingchen didn't smile, she felt scared. But when Su Qingchen smiled, she felt even more scared. Yunge lowered her head and glanced at her not particularly soft but still slender little hand. She could not help but sigh, with a bitter expression. It wasn't her fault this time, but why was Su Qingchen still angry? Her hand would break from writing. Why didn't she realize that Su Qingchen was so easily angered? Of course, these words were only in Yun Ji's mind. Even if she said it out loud, no one would believe her. Did young Master Qingchen get angry easily? The number of people in this world who had seen young Master Qingchen get angry could be counted on one hand. Young Master Immortal's demeanor and upbringing had always been praised. Who dared to slander young Master Qingchen? Beat him up. Of course, Su Qingchen saw Yun Ji's actions. He smiled faintly and didn't explain. He only asked, "Now that you can't find the person you're looking for, what do you plan to do?" Yunge blinked and said gloomily, "That's okay. They're all dead. No wonder they didn't pick me up. I've already grown up. I can do it alone." Su Qingchen shook his head and said, "It's not safe for you to be alone. I've told you before, come with me to Glass City." Yunge quickly shook her head. Although she grew up in the countryside, these few days were enough for her to understand the status of the Su family. Most importantly, even that Marquis Muyang's residence made people feel very restrained the moment they entered. The Su family was bigger than Marquis Muyang's residence, and they were all scholars. There would definitely be more rules. Su Qingchen smiled and said, "There aren't many people in the Su family, and there aren't many rules. Everyone wanted to live their own lives. The reason why your father left a letter for someone to pick you up was because he was worried that you would be alone in the mountains. Now that you can't find anyone and you're going back to the mountains, won't your father's worries come true? Come with me to Glass City. The people there are very nice. Be a good child and listen to me." Yun Ji's eyes turned a little blank. Her lively eyes were filled with uneasiness. Su Qingchen sighed softly and raised his hand to push a strand of hair behind her ear. He said softly, "If you really don't like it, I can help you find another place to live. But at least we can take care of each other in Glass City. You are my savior. Do you want others to call me ungrateful? What's more, didn't you say that I still have to drink the medicine for 3 months? It was not the right way to practice medicine to cast aside a half-cured patient." My grandfather lives in Lishan Academy outside Glass City. There are also people from the Prince Ding mansion guarding that place. When the time comes, you can move there too. Isn't it the same as living in the mountains? Su Qingchen. Yunge bit her lips and looked at Su Qingchen. I know that you are worried that I will be alone in the mountains and have no one to take care of me. That's why you want me to go to Glass City. Thank you. You're such a good person. Then you have to be obedient, understand? Su Qingchen smiled. Then I'll have to trouble you in the future. I'll give you all the things that my father left for me, okay? Yun Ji's eyes lit up and said happily. She had nothing. It would be embarrassing for her to eat and live on Su Qingchen's things. Why not give the things that her father left for her to Su Qingchen? This way, no one would lose out. Her father said that those things were very good and very important. The corner of young Master Qingchen's lips twitched slightly. He had seen the things that Father Shin left for Yun Ge. There was not even a tael of gold or silver. However, there was the deed to the Chu capital that was stuffed under the red sandalwood carving, the luminous pearl that was said to have been used as a marble by a certain someone when he was a child, a box of authentic calligraphy and paintings that were sought after by all scholars in the world, and many lost medical books and rare medicinal herbs that were kept in an inconspicuous small bag. Obviously, this was the dowry that Father Shin had prepared for his daughter. Yun Ge, who thought that she was very poor but was actually very rich, guiltily planned to use these things as rent and living expenses. Su Qingchen coughed softly and said, "No need. These are souvenirs that your father left for you. If I get injured again in the future, just remember to save me and don't charge me." Su Qingchen, you are indeed a good person. Yun Ge looked at him with tears in her eyes. She was so bad. Why did she think that Su Qingchen was fierce? Yun Ge happily followed young Master Qingchen back to copybooks. She had forgotten what had happened at the Marquis Muyang's residence. She also forgot that young Master Qingchen had only been seriously injured once in his life. She did not know when she would be able to pay back her rent and living expenses. Marquis Muyang's residence Mu Yang looked strangely at his gloomy father. Just by looking at his father's expression, he knew that his father must know that Shin Fengru. Why didn't his father admit it? What was even stranger was that young Master Qingchen did not pursue the matter. It was as if he could not tell that his father was lying. Or rather, it was as if he was just asking a routine question. No matter how his father answered, he would still leave. And the last sentence that young Master Qingchen said was even stranger. All of them died. No matter how one looked at it, it seemed that he was talking about the Marquis Muyang's residence. But would young Master Qingchen curse others like this without any restraint? Father, what's going on? Young Master Qingchen and that Miss Yun Ge. Matriarch Mu frowned. That girl is called Yun Ge? Mu Yang nodded. Matriarch Mu sighed softly, but did not say anything else. Yaoji said lightly, it seems that young Master Qingchen values that girl very much. Old Marquis, today, you're smart. Because Yaoji gave birth to the Mu family's only son and had been very decent in all aspects these years. She also helped Mu Yang to deal with some matters in the residence. She was even more considerate than a real daughter-in-law. Therefore, old Marquis Mu Yang was not angry when Yaoji suddenly spoke. He just said lightly. Obviously, Yaoji had already guessed the reason why Su Qingchen brought Yun Ge to the Marquis Mu Yang's residence. Sighing, Marquis Mu Yang said, yes, we do know that Shin Fengru. That girl called Yun Ge is your cousin.
Cousin?
Mu Yang was surprised. He had never heard that he had a cousin. Speaking of which, when that girl called Yun Ge was born, he should be almost 20 years old. If he really had such a cousin, it was impossible for him to not remember. Matriarch Mu nodded and said, that girl's mother is my biological younger sister, your biological aunt.
Mu Yang was a little surprised.
He still remembered that he did have a biological aunt. It was just that this aunt was only 3 or 4 years older than him and had been in poor health since young. It seemed that she had passed away when she was 16. He had only seen this aunt a few times, so he did not have a deep impression of her. If his mother had not mentioned it, he would have forgotten about it long ago. He immediately understood why his father refused to admit it. With the current relationship between the Chu state and the Prince Ding mansion, how could his father dare to admit that young Master Qingchen had delivered himself to his doorstep? Wouldn't that make Prince Li suspect that the Marquis Muyang's residence and the Prince Ding mansion were in cahoots? However, it would be good if he could really establish a relationship with the Prince Ding mansion. The problem was that the Prince Ding mansion's fall off the cliff back then could be considered as Marquis Muyang's doing. How could Prince Ding not bear a grudge? For so many years, Prince Ding did not make a move on the Marquis Muyang's residence already made Marquis Muyang uneasy. How could he dare to hope that he could rely on the Prince Ding mansion? The Marquis Muyang's residence and the Prince Ding mansion were destined to be enemies. Chapter 931. But Muyang did not expect that the courageous girl with high martial art skills was actually his cousin. Muyang, who had no sisters or brothers since childhood, could not help but feel a little regretful. But since the girl was taken care of by the Prince Ding mansion, they did not need to copy her heart. It was better not to see her. Su Qingchen took Yunge back to the small courtyard and met Yi Li's smiling eyes. Yi Li did not ask much, and took Yunge back to the room to pack up and prepare to leave Jiangnan. That night, a group of people left Nanjing and took a boat to the north. The people in Nanjing were excited because of the little emperor's critical illness. Most people did not even know that Princess Ding and Master Qingchen had come and left, taking away their little emperor. The ship sailed steadily on the water. On the deck, Su Qingchen and Yi Li sat opposite each other, admiring the waves that were never seen before. In the cabin, Yunge was taking care of Mo Suyun, who had been unconscious since he boarded the boat. Su Qingchen drank tea leisurely and looked at Yi Li opposite him and said, "Is it okay to leave Dongfengyu's matter to Qin Feng?" Yi Li looked at Su Qingchen jokingly and said, "It seems that Big Brother was also scared by Dongfengyu? Don't worry, Qin Feng is just as calm. Don't worry, there won't be any problems." As for how Qin Feng would deal with Dongfengyu, no one cared. As long as it was confirmed that Dongfengyu was dead. Li came to Jiangnan this time and did a lot of things. Su Qingchen smiled faintly. Although she came to save Su Qingchen, the extra gains were quite considerable. Yi Ying's last attack was enough to make Mo Jingli unable to leave Nanjing for a month or two. He also had to deal with the problems after Mo Suyun's departure and plan how to ascend the throne. It would be difficult for the Chu state to send troops in a short time. Even if Mo Jingli agreed to form an alliance with the northern tribes of Xiling, he would have to wait until next year to go to the north personally. Yi Li smiled faintly and said, "By then, between the northern tribes and the western hill, one side should have already retreated. At that time, when Mo Jingli sends out his troops, the pressure on the Mahist army will be less." Su Qingchen nodded and said, "Li has thought it through very thoroughly. Besides, Li has also planted a few spies in his army. When the time comes, how much strength Mo Jingli's army can really contribute is probably still unknown." "Big brother, you flatter me." Yi Li covered her mouth and laughed. She looked back at the girl who was busy in the half-open cabin and asked, "What do you plan to do, Brother Yunge?" Originally, if Weo was still in Glass City, Yunge could accompany Weo. However, Weo had gone to West Hill. Why don't Big Brother send her to the Prince Ding mansion so that she could accompany Madame Yang? Madame Yang's knowledge and talent are all first class. She can also be taught? Su Qingchen glanced at her lightly and said, "There's no need. Mother and second aunt can also teach her. Besides, second uncle's mansion is also close to our family. Sister-in-law can also accompany her." Yi Li blinked and smiled. "I'm afraid Jung can't wait to be surrounded by the children all day long. How can she have the time?" The same goes for eldest aunt and second aunt. Our two children are still in the Su family. It was very difficult to take care of two children who are not even 1 year old yet. "I have my own arrangements," Su Qingchen said. Yi Li nodded and smiled. "All right then. Anyway, Yunge is Big Brother's savior. Big Brother has the final say on how to settle her." Su Qingchen only pretended not to hear the teasing in his cousin's words. He calmly held the teacup and started to enjoy the scenery on the sea. Because they were worried that they would be intercepted by Jinnan Palace midway, they did not take the canal. They went directly to the estuary and went north after entering the sea. The Shilling army was not good at water battles. After sailing for more than 10 days, they disembarked at a port not far from the original Chu capital, Chongqing City. Su Qingchen brought Yunj and Mo along the way slowly and prepared to return to Glass City. Yili got on a fast horse the moment she disembarked and brought the people to the battlefield. It had been nearly 2 months since Li went to Jiangnan Road. At this time, the northern part of the country was already filled with cold wind and snow. Enchanting had already brought close to 1 million troops to the border with the Mahist army. This time, not only was Enchanting personally leading the troops, Lei Tingfeng was also coming along. It was obvious that Enchanting wanted to wipe out the Mahist army in one fell swoop. This was because he knew that if he missed this opportunity, Enchanting would not have another chance to defeat the Prince Ding Mansion and the Mahist army in his lifetime. The three-nation alliance had a high chance of winning. Unfortunately, they did not start the battle properly. Before they even started, Mo Jingli had already dropped the ball. Enchanting could only curse Mo Jingli in his heart. There was nothing he could do. Although they could not wait for the De Chu State's army to arrive, Shilling and Beirong had close to 2 million troops. More importantly, these two countries were in the north and south, sandwiching the Mahist army in the middle. This caused the Mahist army to be attacked from both front and rear. If one only looked at the geography, they were in a much better position than the Northern Alliance. At this time, Mo Xiuyao had already pushed from the border not far from the Northern Tribe's army to a large citadel in the north of De Chu State. The citadel was less than 100 li away from Spirit Vulture Mountain. It was not far from Feihong Pass, and was not far from Enchanting's army. It was also a path that the northern tribes had to pass through if they wanted to go south from the northwest. Now that the war was about to begin, Mo Xiuyao, as the highest commander of the Mahist army, naturally could not charge into the battlefield like before. He needed to control both the Shilling and northern tribes' battlefields at the same time. He could only silently retreat from the front lines. When Yili arrived at the citadel, she did not inform anyone. She directly went to Mo Xiuyao's temporary residence in the citadel. These areas that were reclaimed by the Mahist army had slowly returned to normal over the past half a year. The best governor's residence in the citadel was still reserved for the citadel's officials. Therefore, Mo Xiuyao could only take his subordinates and squeeze into the commander's residence. Fortunately, most of the Mahist army's generals were fighting on the front lines. Only Feng Jiao, Marquis Nan and a few others were by Mo Xiuyao's side. Even Fu Zhao had personally gone out to lead the troops. The average-sized commander's residence did not seem crowded at all. When Yili arrived at the commander's residence, the guard at the door jumped in fright. When he recovered, he hurriedly came forward to greet Wang Fei and invite her in. Yili did not mind the guard's slight loss of composure. She asked with a smile, "Is the prince in the residence?" The guard nodded and said, "Wang Fei, the prince, Feng Jiao, and Marquis Nan are all present." When she entered the residence, she found out that Mo Xiuyao and the others were discussing in the study. Yili stood at the door and hesitated. Just as she was about to leave, the people inside discovered her presence. The door to the study was pulled open from the inside. Mo Xiuyao stood at the door and looked at her with a smile. He said, "Lili, why aren't you coming in?" Yili looked in puzzlement inside. "Aren't you discussing matters?" Mo Xiuyao grabbed her hand and pulled her inside. "It's nothing important. Also, is there anything in the Wang residence that you cannot hear?" Chapter 932. Inside, Feng Xiao and Marquis Nan looked in surprise at Mo Xiuyao pulling Yili in. Feng Xiao reacted the fastest. He looked at Mo Xiuyao with a grin and teased, "The prince is indeed skilled. Just sitting in the study, you can tell that the princess consort has returned." Marquis Nan looked at the smiling Feng Xiao, and then looked at Mo Xiuyao, who was looking at Feng Xiao coldly, but with a faint warmth in his eyes. He shook his head helplessly and said, "The princess consort has returned?" Young Master Qingchen. Therefore, older people were more reliable. These people did not ask her about her trip to Jiangnan. Yili smiled and said, "Marquis, Thank you for your concern. I am well. Big brother will rest in the Chu capital for 2 days before returning to Li City. Feng Jiao looked at Yili with a grin and said, Princess consort, I heard that young Master Qingchen brought back a beautiful girl with strong martial arts. The Shadow Guard had already reported Yili's trip to Jiangnan to the Prince Ding mansion. Yun Ge was inevitably mentioned. As for the beautiful girl with strong martial arts, it was unknown which Shadow Guard was behind it. Yili tilted her head and quietly looked at Feng Jiao. After a while, she nodded and said, She is indeed a beautiful and cute girl. Her martial arts and medical skills are not bad. Do you want me to ask Big Brother to introduce her to you? Feng Jiao quickly shrunk his neck and raised his hand to rub his stiff face. He smiled bitterly and said, Better not. I don't dare to offend young Master Qingchen. Young Master Qingchen had only brought back such a beautiful and cute girl after a few decades. If he rushed to meet her, wouldn't he be eaten by the Su family? And Mo Xiaoyao was also curious. Although Su Qingchen looked gentle and amiable, he had very high standards.
It was not easy to catch his eye.
I heard that the young lady is related to the Marquis Muyang's household. If that was the case, it would not be good. If that girl was really related to the house of Marquis Muyang, it would be better to ask Su Qingchen to change to another girl. He could not possibly have to give Su Qingchen face when he wanted to make a move on that old thing Marquis Muyang, right? Yili smiled faintly. It doesn't matter now. What do you mean? Feng Jiao and Nan Ho both looked at Yili. Feng Jiao wanted to hear some gossip, while Marquis Nan had some conflicts with Marquis Muyang's residents. He wanted to consider how to treat the girl if they met in the future. Yili told them about how Su Qingchen personally brought Yungo to the house of Marquis Muyang and brought her back. Feng Jiao stared at Yili with his eyes wide open. He asked in disbelief, So, young Master Qingchen cursed his whole family to die in front of Marquis Muyang and the entire Mu family? Why didn't Marquis Muyang stab him a few times? Young Master Qingchen was really an extraordinary person. He usually looked gentle and refined with profound self-restraint. Who would have thought that when he scolded someone, he would be so vicious? Yili shrugged and smiled. This is what I heard from Yun Ge. Feng Jiao silently decided in his heart that he must not provoke that little girl called Yun Ge. Nan Ho thought for a while and said, That girl should be the niece of Marquis Muyang's wife. Speaking of which, she has a little relationship with Dr. Shen.
Huh.
The other three looked at Nan Ho curiously. Nan Ho shook his head and smiled. These are all old affairs in the capital. Prince and princess consort will naturally not care about these things. But our family and the house of Marquis Muyang, Nan Ho's family and the house of Marquis Muyang had never been on good terms. Therefore, they were very clear about some of the bad things of other families. Nan Ho said, Marquis Muyang's wife has a younger sister. Her health has been poor since she was young. Not many people in the Chu capital know her. But when they asked a doctor to treat her, she ran away with a young doctor. Marquis Muyang's family naturally could not afford to lose face. They only said that the girl died of illness. That doctor is Shun Yang's nephew. Although Shun Yang is a famous doctor and the Shen family is also a famous family of doctors, Marquis Muyang's family is also a noble family. How could they agree to marry their daughter to a doctor? I heard from the princess that the girl's surname is Shen, and she is related to the house of Marquis Muyang. It should be this one. Yili asked curiously, when Mrs. Shen eloped, how could Mr. Shen be so sure that he could entrust his daughter to the house of Marquis Muyang before he passed away? Although the house of Marquis Muyang had indeed refused to take care of Yunj, it was mostly because of Su Qingchen and the Prince Ding mansion. Nan Ho smiled. Well, I heard that Marquis Muyang's wife and Mrs. Shen used to be very close. There is a big age gap between them. Although they are sisters, they are like mother and daughter. What's more, Shen Fengru saved Marquis Muyang's life back then. Taking care of a descendant of the Shen family is not difficult. He will naturally agree. But this time, Marquis Muyang has always been a person who steers according to the wind. It is his instinct to seek good fortune and avoid disaster. Since Miss Shen is related to young Master Qingchen, Marquis Muyang will not dare to keep her. It's good that it has nothing to do with the house of Marquis Muyang. Mo Xiaoyao nodded with satisfaction. It did not matter whose daughter Shenyunj was. Yili, it seems that the Su family will have a lot of marriages next year. Except for the youngest Su Qingyan, the other young masters of the Su family were all taken. Yili pursed her lips and smiled. That's not necessarily true. In her opinion, Shenyunj did not have any thoughts about young Master Qingchen. Although Yunj was already 15 or 16 years old and was at the age when a girl first awakened to love, she grew up in the mountains and did not have much contact with people. She probably understood these aspects later. If there were any feelings for Su Qingchen, in Yunj's words, it would be, good person, so smart, so powerful, so fierce. Therefore, young Master Qingchen's future was worrying. What's more, Yili did not really understand what young Master Qingchen meant to Miss Yunj. Chapter 933. Hearing Yili's words, Feng Ziyao and Mo Xiaoyao's expressions became strange. Yili knew what the two of them were thinking when she saw their expressions. They probably wanted to see young Master Qingchen make a fool of himself. It was a pity that this battle would take some time. By the time they finished the battle, young Master Qingchen might have settled everything and returned home with a beautiful woman. These two were regretting that they didn't have the chance to see the greatest young master in the world. Marquis Nan coughed lightly. He deeply felt that he was old and couldn't understand the thoughts of these young people. Prince, third young Master Feng, should we continue? If he let this Feng Jiao get to the bottom of the matter, he might say something that would make him feel awkward. Feng Jiao rubbed his nose. He just remembered that they were discussing business before Yili came. Mo Xiaoyao saw that Yili had returned and was impatient to deal with them. He pulled Yili to sit down and hurriedly gave a few instructions. Then he drove the two out. It was the first time in his life that he was driven out. Marquis Nan stood at the door of the study in a daze. Feng Jiao was very used to it. He pulled Marquis Nan and said with a smile, Marquis, let's go. How about having a drink at my place? Marquis Nan finally recovered. He helplessly shook his head and followed Feng Jiao out. Feng Jiao took a few steps and suddenly stopped with some hesitation. It seemed that he had forgotten to tell the princess consort something. Marquis Nan looked back in confusion. What's wrong? Aren't we going to drink? It seems that there is something that I forgot to tell Wang Fei. Feng Jiao said. Is it business? Is there something that you know that Prince doesn't?
Marquis Nan asked.
Feng Jiao thought about it. That's right. Mo Xiaoyao would always tell Wang Fei. At most, it would be a little later. He waved his hand and swaggered away with Marquis Nan. In the study, Mo Xiaoyao held Yili tightly in his arms and gently rubbed the top of her head. He said in a muffled voice, This time Miss Li has been gone for a long time. Yili smiled helplessly and said, How is 2 months considered long? A round trip from the north to Jiangnan, 2 months, was considered fast. However, Yili also knew that this was not the time to go against Mo Xiaoyao. It's my fault. Come back quickly in the future. Sure enough, Mo Xiaoyao said faintly, a day apart feels like 3 years. Does Mr. Li not miss I at all? Yili was embarrassed. She raised her head and gently kissed Mo Xiaoyao's lips. She said softly, I miss you too, okay? Mo Xiaoyao's eyes darkened. He held the back of Yili's head and pushed it in front of him, deeply deepening the kiss. Yili was shocked but was quickly swept away by Mo Xiaoyao's passionate passion. She closed her eyes and sank into the entanglement of lips and tongues with him. Mr. Li? Mo Xiaoyao murmured Li's name in a low voice. Yili felt his deep voice enter her ears and her entire body go numb. She felt her entire body go soft. Mo Xiaoyao lowered his head and gently tasted the sweetness on her pink lips. Mr. Li, Fuang.
Fuang.
Mother is back, isn't she? Mo Xiaobao's voice mixed with the sound of running came from outside the door. Then there was the sound of knocking on the door. The two people who were still immersed in their tender feelings immediately woke up. Yili looked at the door in surprise. Why is Xiaobao in Wei City? Emo Xiaoyao's face was cold as he swept a glance at the door. He said indifferently, "Last time Feng Sen went back to Li City to do something, he insisted on following. He's not young anymore. It's not a big deal for him to see the battlefield." However, this scoundrel didn't dare to disturb his time with Mr. Li. Emo Xiaoyao snorted and waved his hand in the direction of the door. The door that was originally locked from the inside opened, and Emo Xiaobao, who was lying on the door, almost fell in. Fortunately, Emo Xiaobao had started to learn martial arts in the past 2 years and had some success in the basics. He only needed to lean forward to stand steadily at the door. He looked at his Fu Wang and Yang Qin, who were sitting inside with some confusion, and then looked at the open door. She used so much force but didn't manage to open it. How did it open now?
Chunner.
Yili stood up and looked at her son with a smile. After not seeing him for a few months, he had grown a lot taller. Yang Qin, Emo Xiaobao said absent-mindedly. He immediately stepped into the study and rushed in Yili's direction. Emo Xiaoyao narrowed his eyes. His right hand lightly knocked on the table, and a weasel hairbrush that was originally on the table shot towards Emo Xiaobao. Emo Xiaobao cried out in surprise and hurriedly flew out of the way. He continued to rush towards Yili, Emo Xiaoyao's side again, and another weasel hairbrush on the table shot over. This time, Emo Xiaobao wasn't so lucky. A corner of his clothes was nailed to the pillar by the brush. Emo Xiaobao's outstretched hand was less than 3 inches away from Yili. Emo Xiaobao turned his head to look at his clothes that were nailed to the pillar, and then looked at his Yang Qin, who was just inches away from him. His large eyes immediately became watery. Yang Qin. Fu Wang bullied Xiaobao. Xiaobao misses Yang Qin. Xiaoyao. Looking at her son's outstretched hand looking at her, Yili didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Emo Xiaoyao glanced at Emo Xiaobao in displeasure. He slightly raised his hand, and a force pulled the weasel hairbrush that was stuck in the pillar back. With a bang, it fell into the brush holder in front of Emo Xiaoyao. Emo Xiaobao shrank his neck. He probably understood that he came at the wrong time. Fu Wang's mood was very bad. He carefully squeezed to Yili's side. Yang Qin. Yili reached out and touched Emo Xiaobao's little head. She smiled and said, "Xiaobao has grown taller. Have you been obedient these days?" Emo Xiaobao's eyes lit up. He nodded heavily and said, "Xiaobao is very obedient." Yang Qin, Xiaobao has grown up. Yili found it funny and pinched his little nose. "Grown up? Do you still want Yang Qin to hold you when you grow up?" Looking at Emo Xiaobao's outstretched hand asking for a hug, Yili shook her head. Because she was often not by Emo Xiaobao's side these 2 years, Yili can't help but feel guilty and spoil Emo Xiaobao. However, a 7 or 8-year-old child really shouldn't be hugged like this. Emo Xiaoyao's eyes were about to spit fire. Emo Xiaoyao stepped forward and picked up Emo Xiaobao in front of him. He lightly said, "Have you finished the things I told you?" Emo Xiaobao proudly raised his little face and said, "Of course, it's finished. Isn't it just 2 hours of horse stance, half an hour of swordsmanship, half an hour of horsemanship, and 20 pieces of calligraphy? How can this kind of trivial matter stop him?" Emo Yuchen. Emo Xiaoyao sneered at someone's complacent little face. "Very good. Then starting tomorrow, I'll add another 2 hours of archery and 20 pieces of calligraphy." Emo Xiaobao's little face stiffened. He quickly calculated in his heart. 2 hours of horse stance, 2 hours of archery, then swordsmanship and horsemanship, and 40 pieces of calligraphy. It will take at least 4 or 5 hours to finish. He will be tired to death. I thought, it must be that the homework that I gave you is too easy, so you can be so leisurely. So from today on, I will be strict with you. After all, Father and your mother have high hopes for you. Emo Xiaoyao leisurely said. Chapter 934. Ugh. Emo Xiaobao cried miserably as he looked pitifully at Yili. Yili sighed and looked up at the roof, pretending not to see her son's pleading gaze. She believed that Emo Xiaoyao knew what he was doing. More importantly, the more she helped, the more Emo Xiaoyao wanted to punish Emo Xiaobao. It was better to leave the matters between father and son to them to resolve. Seeing that his pleas for help had failed, Emo Xiaobao fell into despair. Now Emo Xiaobao finally understood that if his father really did flip out, even his mother wouldn't be able to save him. He could only look innocently at Mo Xiaoyao. Father, this child will work hard. Our dear Emo Xiaobao's starry eyes were still quite lethal. Emo Xiaoyao's lips twitched as he looked up at the sky, speechless. Was this really his son? He was too shameless. Good boy, study well. Father has high hopes for you. Emo Xiaobao still underestimated a certain person's heart of stone. Emo Xiaoyao firmly patted his son's shoulder. His pitiful act failed again. Emo Xiaobao stared blankly for a moment before running away in tears. From then on, Acropolis City lost a little tyrant who flaunted his might, and gained a pitiful child who danced at the sound of the rooster. Emo Xiaobao was very smart and didn't need much time to learn. However, the homework Mo Xiaoyao gave him was not something that could be solved with intelligence. No matter how smart Emo Xiaobao was, he would not be able to turn 2 hours into an hour, nor would he be able to turn 40 words into 4. Because of this, the military headquarters clapped their hands in celebration. Of course, Emo Xiaobao also gained something. When he returned to Li City, Mr. Qing Yun and the Su family discovered that Emo Xiaobao had grown taller and healthier. Also, the words that Mr. Heng Yu thought were barely passable had improved quite a bit. It could be said that he had reached a higher level. Although the battle was fierce, Emo Xiaoyao and Yi Li, who were in Acropolis City, were still quite idle. As the commander-in-chief, there was no need for him to personally lead the charge and arrange the troops. Emo Xiaoyao only needed to control the overall situation and the deployment of troops. Naturally, the frontline commanders would be in charge of the front lines. The reason why Emo Xiaoyao had personally come to the battlefield was just to warm up before the big battle, and also because he was bored. Even so, there was still an endless stream of news coming from the front every day. Yi Li and Emo Xiaoyao spent most of their time in the study. Lei Jinting personally led 700,000 troops to attack Ruichang City. He Su and Morong Shun were no match for him. In the study, Yi Li read softly while holding a report that had just arrived on a fast horse. Emo Xiaoyao's expression was calm. He leaned on the chair and said indifferently, "It's not strange. He Su and Morong Shun are indeed no match for Lei Jinting." However, Lei Jinting personally went into battle from the start. Moreover, he brought almost all of the main forces of the Xiling army. Is he trying to compete with I? Feng Jiao raised his eyebrows and smiled. Once the prince goes to fight with Lei Jinting, the north will give Yelu Yi and Helianzhan a chance to catch their breath. I didn't think that Lei Jinting would be willing to make such a sacrifice for me. Yi Li shook her head and said, "This can't be considered a sacrifice. If the northern tribes collapse first, the Western Mausoleum will have no chance." Lei Jinting delayed Xiao. Not only did he give the northern tribes a chance to catch their breath, he also delayed the battle. In another 1 or 2 months, the Dechu State's army should arrive. Feng Jiao frowned and said, "Since that's the case, we should defeat the northern tribes first, and then focus on dealing with the threat in the south. Otherwise, the situation of being attacked from both sides would really make one feel infuriated." That's right, Wang Fei. News of Emo Jingli's ascension should arrive in the next 2 days, right? Feng Ziao asked curiously. He didn't think that Emo Jingli would actually ascend the throne in the end. Although the ascension came a little, but at least he had fulfilled Emo Jingli's long-cherished wish. Yi Li nodded and said, "It should be soon. Once Emo Jingli ascends the throne, it will be time for the Dechu state to send out their troops." Emo Xiaoyao stared at the large map of each country's military strength and war situation spread out on the table in front of him. He pointed at the northern tribes and said, "Since that's the case, let's take care of the northern tribes first." Coincidentally, there should be news of Yalu Hong. Marquis Nan frowned and said, "Then what about General Morong?" Once Ruichang City was breached, then Acropolis and Feihong Pass would be next. Marquis Nan couldn't help but worry. Emo Xiaoyao smiled faintly and said, "Let I see how powerful Lei Jinting, the West Hill war god, is." Marquis Nan, I'll trouble you to guard Acropolis. Feihong Pass is guarded by old General Yuan Pei, so I can rest assured. In addition, I will order Fu Zhao and Lu Jingxian to lead 200,000 troops back as reinforcements. Marquis Nan was shocked and said in a low voice, if the prince calls General Lu back, then what should we do in the north? Once Lu Jingxian led his troops back, there wouldn't be a single general who could take charge of the northern tribes. It was a pity that Zhang Qilan was guarding the West Hill thousands of miles away, and Leng Huai was in the Chu capital. Otherwise, there wouldn't be such a shortage of generals. Mo Xiuyao raised his eyebrows and smiled. I will still go and meet Helianjin personally. In the battle 18 years ago, Mo Xiuyao never admitted that he was defeated by Helianjin. However, the Mahist army was indeed greatly weakened by Helianjin. This matter naturally had to be resolved sooner or later. The southern marquis was slightly stunned by the killing intent in Mo Xiuyao's words. He nodded and said, "This general obeys." However, this general is not belittling himself, but I'm afraid so many people might not be able to stop Enchanting. The title of Enchanting as the West Hill war god didn't fall from the sky. At least, among the generals in the Prince Ding mansion, other than Prince Ding, no one else had the title of Invincible War God. To ordinary people like them, victory and defeat were common occurrences in battle. Marquis Nan had been on the battlefield for a long time and had also suffered many defeats. Mo Xiuyao pointed at Feihong Pass and Acropolis. He smiled and said, 3 months. Defend these 2 places. Marquis Nan, do you think there's a problem? Marquis Nan was silent for a moment. Prince Ding meant to conquer the northern tribes in 3 months? After a long time, Marquis Nan stood up and said loudly, I accept the order. I swear to defend Acropolis with my life. Mo Xiuyao nodded with satisfaction and said, then I'll have to trouble Marquis Nan. As expected, within 2 days, the news of Mo Jingli's ascension to the throne finally spread to Acropolis. After receiving the news, Mo Xiuyao didn't even bat an eyelid. He casually threw the booklet aside and stood up to reach out his hand to Yi Li. Yi Li smiled and shook his hand. It was time for them to go to war. Yi Li and Mo Xiuyao didn't send Mo Xiaobao back to Li City. Instead, they brought Mo Xiaobao to the army camp. The Mahist army men had to enter the army camp at the age of 10 to gain experience. Although Mo Xiaobao was only 7 or 8 years old, there was no harm in following along. It was his first time in the army camp, and Mo Xiaobao was indeed excited. It was a pity that Mo Xiuyao's daily homework was like a mountain pressing down on his head. He didn't have the energy to play with cats and dogs. This time, Mo Xiuyao was also different from the previous time when he was in a stalemate with the northern tribes. Hundreds of thousands of Mahist army were as fast as lightning. They charged towards the city, where the northern tribes were stationed. The northern tribes were originally nomads. They were good at long-distance raids and strong attacks. However, they were extremely weak when it came to defending a city. In just 5 days, they were forced to retreat 400 li before they could regain their footing. Chapter 935. In the northern tribes' camp, Yaluyi looked down at the generals with a dark expression and said in a low voice, Mo Xiuyao has taken 2 cities in a short 5 days. What countermeasures do you have? Helianjin said, I didn't expect that Mo Xiuyao would actually ignore Enchanting, this great enemy, and wholeheartedly attack my army. In this old man's opinion, Mo Xiuyao most likely intends to deal with my northern tribes with all his might before turning to deal with the Western Tomb and Great Chu. Yaluyi looked at Helianjin and said coldly, in other words, General Helian's plan to ally with Xiling and its Chu state has completely failed. Helianjin smiled bitterly. Yaluyi called him uncle most of the time, but now he called him General Helian. Obviously, he was very dissatisfied with him. Helianjin sighed helplessly. If Mo Jingli had not delayed the attack, it would have been more than this. But now the plan to attack the Prince Ding mansion has not failed. It is just that the northern tribes did not gain any benefits. In other words, harming others without benefiting oneself. The Prince Ding mansion indeed had to face the siege of Xiling and its Chu state. But who would have thought that Emo Xiaoyao would not care that the loss of Ruichang would affect Feihong Pass, Acropolis, and even the northwest protected by the Mahist army? He wanted to deal with the northern tribes first. The northern tribes were already at odds with the Mahist army, and war could break out at any moment. The current situation did not cause any losses to the northern tribes. It was just that there were no benefits to being busy for a few months. Princess Ding has gone to Jiangnan these 2 months. Helian Peng, who was sitting below Helian Zhen, suddenly said. Because of the defeat last time, Yaluyi did not like Helian Peng. However, Helian Peng seemed to have changed a lot in these few months. He did not care about Yaluyi's attitude at all. He only did his own thing silently and rarely spoke. This changed Yaluyi's impression of him slightly. Hearing him suddenly speak, Yaluyi frowned and said, Yili went to Jiangnan? How do you know? Helian Peng remained silent, his eyes indifferent as he stared at Yaluyi. He had been defeated by Yi Li and regarded it as the greatest humiliation of his life. Naturally, he would pay close attention to Yi Li. It was just that after those few lessons he no longer acted impulsively. Moreover, Yi Li's heart wasn't that easy to find out. This was something that Helian Peng had slowly guessed over the past few days, based on various clues. Helian Peng lowered his gaze, saying, Father should know that Jinan Palace and the Prince Ding Mansion joined hands to exterminate Infinite Boundless Mountain. Helian Jin nodded. Such a big thing happened not long before he went to Jiangnan, so Helian Jin naturally knew. Helian Peng said, however, after Infinite Boundless Mountain was exterminated, young Master Qingchen went missing for a period of time. However, Glass City did not send anyone to deal with this matter. During this time, Yili has not appeared in front of anyone, so he must have gone to Jiangnan. A trace of anger flashed in Yaluyi's eyes as he said in a low voice, It's Yili again, messing up eyes matters. Mo Jingli's sudden delay in dispatching troops has something to do with Yili. Helian Peng nodded, saying, It should be so. However, even if Yili didn't go, I'm afraid that the matter of the 3 countries forming an alliance wouldn't be so easily resolved. If young Master Qingchen hadn't gone missing, the person who dealt with this matter back then should have been young Master Qingchen. Everyone was silent. Although that was the case, young Master Qingchen was still on the surface after all. It was important to guard against him. And now, they didn't even know what Yili had done in Jiangnan. Helian Peng said, Prince Ding probably wants to drive our northern tribes out of the pass before the Chu state sends troops. At that time, he can focus on dealing with Lei Jinting and Mo Jingli. Yaluyi laughed coldly, saying, wanting to drive our northern tribes out of the pass, how could it be so easy? You guys tell us how to deal with Mo Xiaoyao. Everyone looked at each other. Yaluyi frowned and said, Helian Peng, tell us. Helian Peng said in a low voice, Our northern tribe's army is good at fighting face-to-face. Our cavalry is even better at long-distance raids, but we are not good at defending a city. Now that the Mahist army had the initiative, in the words of the people of the Central Plains, they were using their weaknesses to attack the enemy's strengths. Failure was something that could be expected. Then what do you think we should do? Yaluyi asked. Helian Peng said, In my opinion, we should play to our strengths and avoid our weaknesses. In the entire northern tribes, other than the palace, there were no decent cities. The soldiers of the northern tribes naturally didn't need to defend a city. Now that they had suddenly switched from offense to defense, they naturally had their hands and feet tied. Yaluyi thought for a moment and looked at Helian Jin. Uncle, what do you think? Helian Jin nodded and said, Peng Er's words are reasonable. I am also serious. Our army is at a disadvantage in defending a city. Why don't we take the initiative and attack? In terms of cavalry, even if the northern tribes can't win against the Prince Ding Mansion, they are at least on par. But we have more cavalry than the Black Cloud Cavalry. Although the Black Cloud Cavalry was once known as the most elite force of the Mahist army, they were not the main force of the Mahist army. The main force of the Mahist army was still made up of normal infantry. Because the terrain of Chu state was complicated, cavalry could not be used at all. But the northern tribes was a vast grassland. Their soldiers were mainly cavalry. If they really fought, the Black Cloud Cavalry would definitely not have the upper hand. Yalu Yi frowned and looked at Helian Jun and the others, saying, I agree with Uncle and General Helian's judgment. We can't retreat anymore. The news that came from the palace shows that Father is already very dissatisfied with Ai's lack of progress in the past half a year. We even lost a lot of the land that we originally obtained. If we lose again, I'm afraid that Father will not agree to send more troops to us. The northern tribes had a vast territory, but sparsely populated. It was not as easy to gather troops as the Central Plains. The northern tribes had lost a lot of troops this time, which made the royal house of the northern tribes very dissatisfied. It also gave Yalu Hong a chance to attack them. I understand. Everyone stood up and said. Yalu Yi nodded with satisfaction and said, Good. This time Uncle and General Helian will lead the troops. Helian Peng, don't disappoint I again. Helian Peng said in a low voice, I understand. Please rest assured, Your Highness. Chapter 936. In the Mahist army camp, Mo Shabao sat obediently in a corner of the tent, writing characters. At the same time, he did not forget to eavesdrop on the conversation between Mo Xiaoyao, Yi Li, and the other generals. Mo Xiaoyao had sent Lu Jingxian and the other capable generals to the southern front. Thus, the northern front led by Mo Xiaoyao and Yi Li was left with Yun Ting, Chen Yun and the other young generals. However, as the saying goes, a newborn calf is not afraid of a tiger. These young generals were entrusted with such a task for the first time and were naturally filled with confidence and ambition. After a few victories, they threw their initial worries to the side, and their morale was high. Mo Xiaoyao looked at the young generals calmly and said with a smile after these few days, What do you all feel?
Why don't you share it with I?
The generals looked at each other, and then at Princess Ding. Yun Ting said, We have been winning these few days. Prince, do you feel that there is something wrong? Mo Xiaoyao smiled and said, There is nothing wrong with it. I just want to know what you all think. Everyone was silent for a while. Chen Yun said, Although we have been winning these few days, it is mostly because the northern tribes are not good at defending cities. If the northern tribes gave up on defending cities and fought us head-on, I am afraid we would not have won so easily. After Chen Yun finished speaking, everyone fell silent. Indeed, it was not that they had not fought with the northern tribes before. If they could win so easily, they would not have had to fight for so long. The northern tribes were valiant and good at fighting. They were not as easy to defeat as they thought. It was just that these few days of consecutive victories gave them a feeling that the northern tribes were only SOSO. Not fearing the enemy was a good thing, but underestimating the enemy too much was not a good thing. Thus, facing the pleading gazes of the generals, Yi Li turned a blind eye. Chen Yun, Yun Ting, and the other generals had gone through many years of learning and training. In terms of war, they were not inferior to the veterans. What they lacked was the experience of gambling and the mentality to be indifferent to victory and defeat. However, this kind of mentality could only be honed through countless victories and defeats. This resulted in them being more complacent than the veterans when they won a battle. When they lost a battle, they were more likely to break down than the veterans. The tent was silent for a long time before Mo Xiaoyao nodded his head and said, It is good that you understand. It was because of their complacency over the past few days that everyone felt ashamed. When they saw that Wang Yi was not angry, they all let out a sigh of relief. Yun Ting hesitated for a moment and asked, Prince, do you mean to say the northern tribes will change their tactics? Mo Xiaoyao said, If they do not change their tactics after consecutive defeats, then the northern tribes are really hopelessly stupid. Do you all know what to do? The generals replied in unison, We understand. Mo Xiaoyao nodded and did not ask what they understood. He said, If you understand, then go and prepare. The generals took their leave and left the tent. Mo Xiaoyao turned his head and saw Mo Shabao lying on the table, listening to the conversation with great interest. Seeing the generals leave, he still had a look of regret on his face. Mo Xiaoyao narrowed his eyes and glanced at him. Mo Shabao shrunk his head back and lowered his head to continue writing. Emo Xiaoyao looked at him and asked, "Did you understand the conversation just now?" Emo Xiaobao raised his head, his clever big eyes glancing around. When he found that Emo Xiaoyao was not talking to anyone else, he hurriedly gave a fawning smile. Replying to Imperial Father, "I understand." Emo Xiaoyao asked, "Understand what?" Emo Xiaobao replied obediently. Father reminded the generals not to be complacent and underestimate their opponents just because of a momentary victory. The reason why our army was able to win so easily these few days was because the northern tribes are not good at defending cities. Our army used our strengths to attack their weaknesses. Now that the northern tribes have changed their tactics, our army might be flustered because of carelessness. Emo Xiaoyao nodded and reluctantly agreed with Emo Xiaobao's words. He raised his eyebrows and looked at him. "Then, what do you think we should do if the northern tribes attack us directly?" "Ere this?" Emo Xiaobao frowned and thought for a long time. Then his eyes lit up and he looked at Emo Xiaoyao expectantly. "The northern tribes are good at fighting in the wilderness, and they are very fast. We can lure them into the mountains. The northern tribes are not familiar with the terrain, and the cavalry is not good at fighting in the mountains. We can win." After saying that, Emo Xiaobao blinked his eyes proudly, his big eyes saying, "Praise me, praise me." Emo Xiaoyao smiled faintly and flicked his head. He smiled faintly and said, "At your age, it is not bad that you can think of so many things." Emo Xiaobao was stunned and stared at his father unhappily. Is this a compliment? Eldest uncle and great-grandfather would never praise anyone like that. Grandfather said that Chun'er is very smart. Emo Xiaobao, who felt that he was being looked down upon by his father, proudly threw himself into Yili's arms. "Mother, father is bullying me." Yili laughed and patted his little head. "Your father was obviously praising you. How did it turn into bullying you?" Emo Xiaobao pouted his little mouth and said, "Xiaobao is not young. It's already good that he thinks so much." Xiaobao's idea is obviously very good. Grandfather and uncle both praised Xiaobao for being so smart. Yili sighed helplessly and smiled at Emo Xiaobao. "But what you thought of is something that everyone can think of.
There is nothing special about it.
Why don't you go out and ask Qinyun and the rest, see if they can think of it too?" Actually, it was a very common thing for adults to praise a child for being smart. And Emo Xiaobao was indeed worthy of being praised for being smart. But the people who praised him were not ordinary people. Thus, Emo Xiaobao could not help but think that his intelligence was unparalleled. Now that he received a small blow from Emo Xiaoyao, he was a little unhappy. Woo. Lying on Yili's knees, Emo Xiaobao looked pitifully at Yili. Yili smiled and rubbed his son's head. "And your father is right. You are still young and do not have as much knowledge as an adult. Naturally, there are many things that you cannot think of. This does not mean that our Xiaobao is not smart." Emo Xiaoyao raised his brows and took out 2 books from the side. He placed them in front of Emo Xiaobao and said, "Finish reading these 2 books, then write down how you think this battle should be fought for me. If it is not bad, I will admit that you are very smart." Emo Xiaobao's eyes lit up. Receiving his father's approval and praise was something that every child desired. But Emo Xiaobao and Emo Xiaoyao got along with each other because of one blow after another. Although Emo Xiaobao usually disliked his father, he was more persistent in praising Emo Xiaoyao. As expected, when Emo Xiaoyao finished speaking, Emo Xiaobao snatched the books and hugged them. "It's a promise. If I think of a good idea, father will use my idea to fight the enemy." Chapter 937. Emo Xiaoyao nodded without hesitation and smiled. "No problem. Just stay in the tent and study these 2 books for the next few days. Father will also send people to bring over some files of the northern tribes for you to refer to. As long as the method you propose can stand up to scrutiny and test, I will not only use your method, I can also announce to the world that this battle was fought by you, Emo Xiaobao." "It's Emo Yuchen," Emo Xiaobao said with dissatisfaction and pride. What Xiaobao was really not magnificent. He did not even dare to imagine what kind of feeling he would have if he had done something that was famous throughout the world and heard people discussing Ding Palace's Mo Xiaobao is really triple X. Okay. Mo Xiaoyao nodded. As long as you can do it, I will no longer call you Mo Xiaobao. But on the contrary, you have to shout 3 times in front of the entire camp. This prince is called Mo Xiaobao. Okay. It's a promise. A gentleman's promise. Mo Xiaoyao looked at Mo Xiaobao's short stature with disdain and lazily added, a whip on a fast horse. Thus, Mo Xiaobao, who suddenly had a goal, picked up 2 thick books and quickly ran out of the tent. As he did so, he turned around and waved at Yili. Mother, wait for your child to win glory for you. Yili helplessly raised her hand to cover her face and smiled. Son, even though Mother is used to calling you Mo Xiaobao, but Mother still does not want the world to know you are called Xiaobao. Prince, scheming against a young child, you really have a lot of free time. Yili looked at Mo Xiaoyao with a smile that was not a smile. Mo Xiaoyao raised his eyebrows and smiled. I clearly made an agreement with him openly. How is it scheming? Yili said, is that so? When Xiaobao finishes reading the 2 books you gave him and the files you send over and thinks of a plan, 1 or 2 months should have passed, right? By then, the battle between the Mahist army and the northern tribes would have already been settled, not to mention how to deal with the northern tribes. No matter how smart Mo Xiaobao was, he was still a child. A normal child would only be enlightened at the age of 7 or 8. The 2 books that Mo Xiaoyao gave him were not only very long, they were also very difficult to understand. Even Enchanting had to spend 2 to 3 months before he finished reading them, not to mention a child like Xiaobao who couldn't even recognize words. Therefore, from the very beginning, this gamble was a scheme devised by Mo Xiaoyao to attack Mo Xiaobao. Since Miss Li knows, why didn't she say anything? Mo Xiaoyao said with a smile, it seems that Miss Li also thinks that I didn't do anything wrong, right? Yili was speechless. Mo Xiaobao was indeed a little arrogant. Otherwise, she wouldn't have had such a big reaction to Mo Xiaoyao's words that could be considered praise. There was nothing wrong with being attacked a little. After all, there were many people who could satisfy his self-confidence. Yili looked helplessly at Mo Xiaoyao and said with a dangerous smile, be careful that he doesn't mess with you later. Mo Xiaoyao chuckled in a low voice. That brat is best at seeking luck and avoiding misfortune. He only knows how to mess with you. Mo Xiaobao had long understood his father's heart of stone. Therefore, he normally wouldn't mess around with Mo Xiaoyao. Furthermore, his goal was to surpass Mo Xiaoyao and step on his father's head. If he were to fool around with his Lord Father now and wait until he defeated his Lord Father in the future, then his Lord Father would announce this matter to the public. Wouldn't his prestige as the heir of Prince Ding be completely gone? Hearing this, Yili's face couldn't help but turn black. As expected by Mo Xiaoyao, the northern tribes changed their strategy the next day. They didn't wait for the Mahist army to attack the city as usual. Instead, he led the cavalry out of the city and directly engaged in a decisive battle with the Mo family army a few miles away. Although the Mo family army was prepared for this, they were still inconvenienced by the northern cavalry's rampage. Not only did the number of casualties rise, but they couldn't even touch the edge of the city walls, let alone attack the city. Although the northern tribes had also suffered some losses, they were at most on par with each other, with both sides suffering some losses. It was a far cry from their previous easy victory. Once they returned to the camp, all the generals gathered to discuss how to deal with the northern tribes' cavalry. Actually, they were already experienced in dealing with the northern tribes' cavalry. After all, the Mahist army and the Mahist army had fought many times. The reason why the Black Cloud cavalry of the Mo family army was so strong was largely due to the presence of the northern tribes' cavalry. However, such a large-scale battle was rare in the history of both countries. Even though the Mahist army had suffered heavy losses, it was because the soldiers died in vain and not in battle. In terms of battle, the number of soldiers who died in battle was probably not as high as this one. Hence, it was not appropriate to use cavalry against cavalry now. The Black Cloud cavalry only had about 150,000 men in recent years. However, the northern tribes were all cavalry. How is it? Does anyone have any good ideas?
Chun Yun asked.
At the side, Sun Yao chuckled. The northern tribe's horses are indeed powerful. However, if their horses can't even run… Sun Yao was an unorthodox general and had always been a little wretched when it came to fighting. Yunting was puzzled. He frowned and asked, "Drug their horses?" But the horses are the foundation of the northern tribe's army. They will definitely send people to guard them. If we want to drug them, even with Qilin's help, it will be difficult. Furthermore, how many drugs would it take to drug all of the horses? Furthermore, it would have to be done at the same time. However, there were hundreds of thousands of horses. How many people would it take to drug them? Sun Yao rolled his eyes at him and said, "Of course, I'm not sending someone to poison them. I'm afraid sending someone to assassinate Yaluyi is more reliable than poisoning the war horses." Everyone had interacted for a long time and understood each other's temperament. Yunting was not angry and looked at Sun Yao. "Then what do you have in mind? You can't possibly say this for nothing, right?" Sun Yao laughed. "Why would I say such nonsense? We can do this." Sun Yao leaned over and whispered a few words into Yunting's ear. Hearing this, Yunting's eyes lit up. He leaned over and whispered into Qinyun's ear. Everyone gathered around the fire, and the atmosphere became lively. Sun Yao's idea seemed to have sparked their train of thought. Everyone started talking in full swing. "I think we can do this," Yunting said. "I think this is better," Zhou Min said proudly. "Actually, I think this is even better," Chun Yun added. In a hidden spot not far away, Yili stood beside Imo Xiaoyao and smiled as she looked at the generals who were discussing intensely around a ball of fire. She smiled and said, "Looks like the previous reminder was useful. Today's battle did not lower their morale at all. They will be even more motivated to fight now." Imo Xiaoyao nodded and said, "If they can't even overcome this small setback, they don't have the right to stay in the Mahist army. Xiaoyao, do you think their idea will work? We will know tomorrow if it works." Chapter 938. On the second day of the battle, the Mahist army came up with all kinds of strange methods. The Mahist army carried bags of hay and the food that the horses liked on their backs. The moment the bag was opened, the horses spilled fodder onto the ground. The northern tribes were already running low on fodder this month. The moment the horses caught a whiff of the fodder, they were immediately killed by the soldiers of the Mo family. Even if they were not killed, they were immediately knocked out by the medicine in the fodder. There were also all kinds of strange traps, ropes, spears, crossbows, and so on. There were all kinds of things, only those that could not be done were not thought of. These things were obviously made overnight. Although they were not very smooth, they still caused a lot of damage to the northern tribes. This day ended with the northern tribes retreating back to the city in defeat. In the northern tribes' camp, Yaluyi was once again enraged. Actually, he knew that he could not blame Helianpeng for the loss of today's battle. But under the continuous losses, if he did not give Helianpeng a good scolding, he really did not know how to vent his anger. Helianpeng did not explain and knelt in the middle of the tent, waiting for Yaluyi to finish venting his anger. After venting his anger, Yaluyi looked at Helianpeng, who was kneeling in the tent, and felt a little guilty. He frowned and waved his hand, saying, "General Helian, please rise." Helianpeng said in a low voice, "It's all my fault. Seventh Prince, please punish me." Yaluyi sighed and said, "It's not your fault. The people of the Prince Ding mansion have always been crafty. We knew that they would come up with such a sinister idea." The Mahist army coming up with such an idea was probably because they knew that the northern tribes were lacking in food. Helianpeng said, "Your Highness need not worry. Today's method can only be used once. After today, we will not be able to use it again. But I'm afraid that they will come up with other methods." Yaluyi frowned and said, "General Helian, what methods do you have?" Helianpeng said, "Our previous thinking was not wrong. The northern tribes' cavalry had indeed caused a lot of trouble for the Mahist army. Otherwise, they would not have used their own rations to deal with our cavalry. What this general means is that we need to increase our speed and attack the Mahist army even more fiercely so that they won't be able to cope." Yaluyi pondered for a moment, then said, Fine, we'll do as you say. Your Highness, an envoy from the palace wishes to see you, reported the guard outside the tent. Yalu Yi and Helian Peng exchanged a glance. Yalu Yi frowned. The royal court's messenger. At this time, why would royal father send someone here? Helian Peng said in a deep voice, Your Highness, for His Majesty to send an envoy here at this time. If it isn't to reward Your Highness, then I'm afraid the situation is far from good. However, everyone knew that the northern tribes were in a disadvantageous position right now. The northern tribes' army had been losing battle after battle. It was hard to believe that this was a reward. Yalu Yi also knew this in his heart. He nodded and ordered, Go invite uncle over. Helian Peng replied in a deep voice, Yes. Not long after, Helian Zhen and Helian Peng entered the tent. The royal court's messenger had just arrived. That person stood in the tent and looked respectfully at Yalu Yi. However, Helian Zhen and Helian Peng's hearts sank. This person was Yalu Hong's man. At this time, the northern tribe's messenger was from the crown prince's faction. The meaning of this was self-evident. The messenger glanced at Helian Zhen and Helian Peng and smiled, Your Highness, may I read the king's edict now? Yalu Ye's face darkened as he nodded and said, Messenger, please. The messenger did not mind his coldness. He took out a roll of yellow cloth and unfolded it. He recited in a long voice, The king's edict. The seventh prince has led his army here, but has been defeated repeatedly and has lost soldiers and generals. The messenger read the long edict. In fact, it was only a short sentence. It reprimanded Yalu Yi for leading the army and causing the northern tribes to lose soldiers and generals, causing the northern tribes to suffer great losses. He even hurriedly submitted a request for troops. The king of the northern tribes ordered Yalu Yi to defeat Mo Xiaoyao and the Mahist army within 2 months. Otherwise, he would hand over the military power to someone else. Although it was not explicitly stated who that someone else was, Yalu Yi could guess that if he lost, the one who would benefit in the end would naturally be the crown prince, Yalu Hong. Your Highness, I wonder if Your Highness understands the king's meaning? After reading the edict, the messenger smiled and asked, The king is anxious about the war in the Chu state and is worried sick. I hope Your Highness can understand. Yalu Yi snorted and coldly said, Thank you for your reminder. I naturally understand. The messenger smiled. It's good that you understand. In that case, this official will follow Your Highness in the army for the next few days. When the time comes, I can quickly report the victory to the king. He was going to supervise the army. Yalu Yi narrowed his eyes. The northern tribes had never had an army supervisor. They listened to whoever led the army. However, this messenger came under the orders of the king of the northern tribes and naturally had the right to control the entire army. In this way, Yalu Yi, the prince and commander-in-chief, would be restricted in every way and could be reported to the king of the northern tribes at any time. Yalu Yi knew that the current situation was extremely unfavorable for him. His royal father was probably very dissatisfied with him in the royal court. The best choice was naturally to hand over the military power to Helian Zhen and immediately return to the royal court to explain to his royal father. After all, as a prince, nothing was more important than the trust of the king of the northern tribes. However, Yalu Yi also understood that once he left, Helian Zhen, who had not led an army for more than 10 years, might not be able to control these hundreds of thousands of troops. When the time came and the troops fell into Yalu Hong's hands, he would really have nothing. Yalu Yi looked indifferently at the messenger below, a trace of cold killing intent flashing through his eyes. He nodded slightly. In that case, I will have to trouble Your Highness. Since he was already one step behind, the crown prince in the royal court was probably already prepared. In that case, why should he retreat? His royal father's trust and military power were both important to him. The messenger did not seem to hear the cold intent in his words and nodded with a smile. Thank you, Your Highness. Chapter 939. The fact that the king of the northern tribes had sent an envoy to the Chu state naturally could not be hidden from the Prince Ding mansion. In the Mahist army camp, Yili looked at the report in her hand and frowned. The king of the northern tribes sent an envoy at this time. Does he not trust Yaluyi anymore? Mo Xiaoyao smiled. It's not that he doesn't trust him, but Yaluyi has lost many battles these days. The territory that the northern tribes have now is less than half of the territory that the northern tribes used to have in the Dechu state. The king of the northern tribes is naturally not satisfied with him, but the choice of envoy is a little interesting. I'm afraid that Yaluyi does not trust the king of the northern tribes anymore. Yili looked at it seriously and muttered, "This envoy is Yalu Hong's man?" Mo Xiaoyao nodded, looking very satisfied. Yalu Hong didn't disappoint this king's expectations after all. To be able to do this, to be able to hold the position of crown prince of the northern tribes for so many years, he is indeed not an ordinary person. Yalu Hong wants Yaluyi to suspect that the king of the northern tribes does not trust him and make him betray him today. Is he not afraid that Yaluyi will return to the northern tribes and cause trouble for him? Yili raised her eyebrows. Mo Xiaoyao smiled. Because he is very sure that Yaluyi will not be able to return to the northern tribes. Even if he is lucky enough to return, he will definitely not have the strength to fight with him. Yili nodded and thought for a while before shaking her head. Yalu Hong wants to control Yaluyi's military power. I'm afraid it will not be so easy. Instead, the envoy may lose his life. Although she did not know Yaluyi well, Yili still had some understanding of his personality. He may very well suspect that the king of the northern tribes does not trust him and thus betray him, or even do something that he should not do. But it would not be so easy for Yalu Hong to get his hands on military power. Unless Yalu Hong personally came, the people he sent would probably all die at the hands of Yaluyi. Should we secretly help them? Yili asked. Mo Xiaoyao shook his head. No need. Yaluyi can do whatever he wants. If he can't kill Yalu Hong's men, we can help him. Yili understood Mo Xiaoyao's meaning. They were temporarily cooperating with Yalu Hong, but they weren't friends. Naturally, they didn't need to help him all the time. Furthermore, Yalu Hong wanted to take control of the army and withdraw the northern tribe soldiers out of the pass, while Mo Xiaoyao wanted all the northern tribe soldiers to die in the pass. Obviously, the two sides had different standpoints. Since Yalu Hong wanted to snatch it, they would just let the two brothers kill each other and reap the benefits. Yili nodded and said with a faint smile, "Prince, what a good plan." Mo Xiaoyao smiled proudly at Yili and said, "Wife also thinks that your husband is very smart, right?" Yili smiled but didn't say anything. In her heart, she was sweating profusely. Mo Xiaoyao's schemes were not just smart. There were many smart people in this world, but they always lacked something. For example, Su Hongyu lacked ambition. Another example was young Master Qing Chen, who lacked ruthlessness. Mo Xiaoyao lacked none of these. Most importantly, he could wrap all these up in a harmless appearance. Otherwise, Mo Jingqi would not have tolerated him for so many years. Intelligence, decisiveness, patience, ambition, ruthlessness, Mo Xiaoyao did not lack any of these. That was why he could single-handedly turn the Prince Ding mansion from its crumbling state to its current state. That was why he could start planning so many years ago, making the current situation under the heavens under his control. Li, is I not smart? Mo Xiaoyao rubbed against Yili's body unwillingly. Yili said helplessly, "Who in this world dares to say that Prince Ding is not smart?" Those who thought that their intelligence was higher than Prince Ding's were either fools or truly smart people. The former was already dead, while the latter knew what could be said and what could not. Mo Xiaoyao nodded in satisfaction and planted a kiss on Yili's face. So, to be able to become Ai's beloved wife, Li is also the smartest woman. Yili rolled her eyes helplessly and slapped his handsome face away. "Prince, are you planning to boast in front of me? Aren't you afraid of being laughed at? If anyone dares to laugh at Ai's Li, I will kill them," Mo Xiaoyao said in a low voice. In the end, she couldn't bear to slap his handsome face with his white hair. Yili reached out and pinched his face instead. In these few years, Prince Ding had become more and more shameless. It was a world of difference from the cultured and refined noble prince who had a slightly alienated aura when they first met. Yili suspected that there was something wrong with her eyes at the time. As expected, Lily likes eyes face, huh? You can't bear to part with it, right? No problem, if Lily likes it, then Lily can pinch me. Yili couldn't really pinch Mo Xiaoyao, so Mo Xiaoyao was happy to enjoy it. He simply laid down on Yili's lap and smiled with his eyes closed. After hearing what he said, Yili couldn't continue pinching him. She could only withdraw her hand. Prince, I find that you are becoming more and more. Prince, Feng Xiao rushed in and froze at the door. Looking at the two people inside, Feng Xiao deeply felt that he had forgotten to look at the almanac before leaving. Coughing lightly, Feng Xiao said seriously, "You can continue. I will take my leave." Mo Xiaoyao sat up and looked unhappily at Feng Xiao. What's the matter? Feng Xiao waved the thing in his hand. It's not a big matter. The new envoy from the northern tribes' camp seems to be dying. So fast? Yili asked curiously. Although she had expected that the envoy wouldn't live for long, but it had only been 2 days. Wasn't it a little too fast? Feng Xiao said, I heard that he's not acclimatized to the climate. It wasn't that there weren't any cases of acclimatization, but it was rare for it to be serious to the point of death. And it was usually from the extreme north to the extreme south, or from a dry and cold place to a hot and humid place. Although the north of Dechu State was slightly different from the north of the northern tribes, it wasn't that obvious in the season. It was just not as cold as the winter of the northern tribes. Who would believe that this servant would die from acclimatization? But it wasn't important whether they believed it or not, as long as there was a reason. Mo Xiaoyao thought for a moment and said, "Send a letter to Yelu Hong's people. As to whether they can make it in time to save him, it doesn't matter to the Prince Ding mansion." Feng Xiao understood and nodded with a smile. "I will send the letter in a moment, no, tomorrow." It would take at least 2 or 3 days for the letter to reach Yelu Hong's people. By the time Yelu Hong's people arrived, it would be just enough time for the envoy to take care of. Seeing that there was nothing to do, Feng Xiao very consciously rubbed his nose and said, "I will take my leave." Mo Xiaoyao snorted softly and left him with disdain. Feng Xiao shrugged his shoulders and turned around to leave. Standing at the entrance of the large tent, Feng Xiao silently looked at the sky. Shouldn't it be Wang Fei, who is blushing and shy when he sees that? Why was Wang Fei's expression normal, but the prince's face was red? Seeing Feng Xiao leave with a strange expression, Yili tilted her head to look at Mo Xiaoyao's handsome face that was slightly red from being pinched. She couldn't help but laugh. Mo Xiaoyao touched his own face and understood why she was laughing. He sighed helplessly and said, "Li," since Feng Xiao saw it. Chapter 940. What do you want to do? Yili stared at him warily. Mo Xiaoyao pounced on Yili and kissed her happily. "Since I've been seen, if I don't do anything, wouldn't I have let Feng Sen laugh for nothing?" Mo Xiaoyao. Yili pretended to be angry and glared at him. Mo Xiaoyao was in a good mood and smiled at Yili. "I want to do it in broad daylight." Yili's face turned red and she glared at him. Was it something to be proud of in broad daylight? Seeing Mo Xiaoyao's proud smile, Yili looked up gloomily and bit his lips. Mo Xiaoyao was stunned, and then he laughed loudly. He lowered his head to admire his wife's slightly tipsy and angry look. "Lily, you're so beautiful." Yili did not have time to react before her red lips were captured by a certain someone's passionate lips. In an instant, the two of them fell into a passionate kiss. The battle between the Mahist army and the northern tribes continued, but the changes in internal energy were not known to outsiders. The messenger who had just arrived at the northern tribes' camp and tried to take over the army died a few days later because he could not acclimatize to the environment. By the time Yelu Hong's men arrived, they did not even have time to collect the corpse before it was burned to ashes by Yelu Yi. Yelu Hong's men were naturally enraged, but after seeing Yelu Ye's methods, they did not dare to go against him. They sent a secret letter back to the royal house of the northern tribes and reported it to the king of the northern tribes. The king of the northern tribes was naturally furious. Yalu Yi had led his troops to attack the Dechu state and occupied a large part of the Dechu state's territory. After his military exploits, he could be said to be the best among the princes and generals of the northern tribes. After that, he started to disobey orders. Then in Glass City, he caused the king of the northern tribes' beloved Qing Yi Na to die for no reason. After Yalu Hong returned, it was inevitable that he would add fuel to the fire, causing the king of the northern tribes to be even more worried about Yalu Yi. But even so, he did not think that Yalu Yi would have any ulterior motives. So when Yalu Yi asked for help, the king of the northern tribes did not hesitate to promote Helianzhen, whom he did not like much, and sent reinforcements. However, he did not expect that this time. He only sent someone to reprimand him, and the messenger died for no reason. The king of the northern tribes did not believe that it was because of a lack of acclimatization. The reason why the king of the northern tribes sent him to the Dechu state was because he had been to the Dechu state before. After the king of the northern tribes flew into a rage, he immediately ordered Yalu Yi to return to the northern tribes and hand over the military authority to the crown prince Yalu Hong. Upon receiving the king of the northern militants' decree, Yalu Hong was naturally overjoyed. Without another word, he packed his things and rushed towards the Dechu state. On the battlefield, the northern tribes' army and the Mahist army had been fighting for the past few days, and both sides had their fair share of victories and losses. However, the northern tribes' army's battle line was still slowly being pushed back. Today, the weather in the north was getting colder and colder. Within the northern tribes' territory, thousands of li were covered in ice and snow. Regardless of whether it was rations or soldiers, it was extremely difficult to replenish. Furthermore, the Dechu state that they occupied in the past few years had been ravaged and barren. There were no signs of human habitation. Thus, compared to the Mahist army who had an endless supply of rations, the northern tribes' soldiers had a miserable winter. On this day, Mo Xiaobao excitedly rushed out of his tent and rushed into Mo Xiuyao's tent like the wind. He proudly waved a few pieces of paper filled with words. "Father, Mother, I've thought of it." At this time, it was almost the end of the year. Mo Xiuyao and Yi Li were discussing the next step with the generals. Although they seemed to have victory in their hands, the battle with Lei Jinting in the south was extremely difficult. Although there were a few old generals working together to stop Lei Jinting's advance, if they continued to drag things out, when Mo Jingli's army arrived, the situation in the south would immediately crumble. Seeing Mo Xiaobao rush in, the generals couldn't help but look at him curiously. Mo Xiuyao raised his brows and took a look at the proposal written by Mo Xiaobao. Mo Xiaobao smiled proudly and said, "How is it? Father, this child's idea is not bad, right?" Mo Xiuyao casually passed the document to Yi Li. After Yi Li looked at it, she smiled faintly at Mo Xiaobao and passed it to Yunting, who was already stretching his neck in joy. Seeing his mother smile at him, Mo Xiaobao's heart calmed down. Below, the generals whispered to each other as they looked at the document in Yunting's hand. They nodded their heads and praised. Using traps to trap the northern tribes' cavalry and iron caltrops, and cutting off the legs of the horses, luring the northern tribes' army into the mountains and surrounding them. Good idea. Did the crown prince really come up with this? It wasn't that these ideas were amazing. After all, a large portion of them were things that they had played with recently. Furthermore, some of them were common knowledge against cavalry. But Mo Xiaobao was different. He was only 7 or 8 years old and could think of so many things. He even understood the characteristics of the northern tribes' army and the terrain of the battle. This was not something an ordinary child could do. Everyone couldn't help but praise in their hearts. As expected of the Prince Ding Mansion's crown prince, he was really precocious. Mo Xiaobao stared at Mo Xiuyao proudly, glaring at him as he admitted defeat. Mo Xiuyao looked at him lazily and pointed at Sun Yawu, asking Yawu, "Do you think the crown prince's plan can be implemented?" Sun Yawu looked awkwardly at the expectant crown prince. He hesitated and said, The crown prince's plan is not bad. However, this terrain is at least 100 to 200 li away from where we are now. Now that we are in a flat land, the crown prince's plan, to lure them into the mountains and annihilate them will be difficult.
Ah!
Emo Xiaobao was stunned. Looking at his father's smiling face, he stomped his feet and said unwillingly, "This is not fair. General Sun, you just need to tell me whether or not this prince's plan can be realized before then." Sun Yao thought for a moment and said sincerely, "Although there are still some small flaws, they can't obscure the jade. It should be possible." "Father." Emo Xiaobao turned his head proudly. Emo Xiaoyao looked at him with a smile and said gently and lovingly, "Xiaobao, there is something that I don't know if anyone has taught you, but I still have to tell you. There is a saying that speed is the most important thing in war. It has already been more than a month since you left. If you were to lead the army into battle, are you going to tell Ye Lu Yi that this crown prince has not thought of a plan and that we will fight again in a month?"
And?
Emo Xiaobao's proud little face fell, and he looked pitifully at Yili. Yili looked at him with a smile. Seeing his mother's expression, Emo Xiaobao knew that there was no hope for help. On the other hand, Emo Xiaobao also knew that Emo Xiaoyao was right. He thought that he was very smart, but if he really was to go into battle, why would the enemy give him a month to think of a plan? After hearing about the Mahist army's situation in the past month, Emo Xiaobao's face darkened. He wasn't as smart as he thought. Chapter 941. Actually, Emo Xiaobao was being too harsh on himself. Given his age, to be able to finish reading the military book that Emo Xiaoyao gave him in a month's time, and even come up with a plan that a general like Sun Yao would evaluate based on the terrain and the strength of the two armies, he could already be proud of himself. However, Emo Xiaoyao and Yili did not console him. The heir of the Prince Ding mansion was born with a different responsibility from normal children, so it was not wrong to give Emo Xiaobao some pressure at the appropriate time. Seeing him admit defeat, Emo Xiaoyao looked at him with a smile and said, "Then isn't it time to fulfill your promise?" Emo Xiaobao's little face instantly darkened, and he stiffly turned his head to look at Yili. Yili smiled faintly and said, "Xiaobao, you must accept your loss. This time, just treat it as buying a lesson. You learn from your mistakes. In the future, don't casually make a bet with your father." Emo Xiaobao glared fiercely at Emo Xiaoyao, then angrily rushed out of the tent. Seeing him like this, everyone was curious about what kind of bet the little heir had made with the prince. They all bid farewell to Emo Xiaoyao and Yili, then slipped out of the tent to see the little heir fulfill his bet. Emo Xiaoyao did not make things difficult, waving his hand to let everyone leave. Emo Xiaobao stood in the middle of the camp with his hands behind his back, in the most crowded spot. The soldiers coming and going did not see the little heir's small stature, delicate little face, and serious expression. They could not help but stop to see what the little heir was doing. Emo Xiaobao gritted his teeth and fiercely swept his eyes over the soldiers around him. Helplessly, he found that the people around him did not decrease because of his glare, but increased instead. He could only grit his teeth, close his eyes, and shout loudly, "This heir is called Emo Xiaobao." The soldiers present were all stunned. Someone burst out laughing, and the people around them also burst out laughing. A name like Xiaobao was actually very common, but it was usually given by illiterate people from ordinary families or nicknames given by ordinary families. Most of the time, it was done in private at home. Now, such an amiable and common name was given to the crown prince of the noble Prince Ding mansion, but it was very funny. Looking at little Prince Mo's ink-colored brocade robes and his adorable appearance, she felt that this name was extremely fitting. Realizing that he was being mocked, Emo Xiaobao's face turned red. He stomped his feet and rushed back into the tent. She rushes into Yili's arms, feeling wronged. "Nyangqin, all right, no one is laughing at you." Yili smiled and comforted her son's little head. Emo Xiaoyao, on the other hand, was smiling happily, not caring about his son's pride at all. Seeing this, Xiaobao gritted his teeth in hatred. In his heart, he silently complained about his grandfather. Why didn't he give his father a nickname back then? "Nyangqin, father is bad. Father bullies Xiaobao." Emo Xiaobao said with tears in his eyes. Yili lowered her head and kissed his forehead, smiling. "Who told you to make a bet with your father? Tell me, what were you thinking when you made a bet with your father?" Emo Xiaobao lowered his head in silence. When father said that he would make a bet with him, he only thought about what would happen if he succeeded, but he didn't think carefully about whether he could succeed or not. Although this was a trap that father buried for him, if he didn't get carried away and become arrogant, perhaps he wouldn't be fooled. Nyangqin, Yili raised her eyebrows and said, "You know you were wrong." And Emo Xiaobao repeatedly nodded, hiding in Yili's arms in shame, unwilling to get up. Yili pulled him up and smiled. "Silly child, this is for your father. What's there to be shy about? You just need to remember this lesson. When your father was your age, he also thought about fighting with your grandfather and uncle all day long." "Really?" Emo Xiaobao's eyes lit up, looking at Emo Xiaoyao with shining eyes. Emo Xiaoyao gave a soft snort, looking at Emo Xiaobao with a teasing look. "But I am not that stupid. This heir will win one day." Emo Xiaobao gave a snort, his little face proudly raised. Emo Xiaoyao carelessly nodded and said, "I will wait." "Humph." Emo Xiaobao angrily snorted, "This heir won't make you wait for too long. Just you wait. This prince will definitely make you announce your nickname in front of everyone." "Whatever." As if he was angered by Emo Xiaoyao's attitude, Emo Xiaobao stomped his feet and rushed out of the tent like a gust of wind. Yili sighed helplessly as she watched Xiaobao leave in a huff. She smiled at Emo Xiaoyao and said, "Are you happy now?" Emo Xiaoyao smiled. "Ali, I'm doing this for Xiaobao's sake. Look at this kid. At such a young age, his eyes are already on top of his head. If we don't ruthlessly suppress him, in another 2 years, he won't even know his own name." Yili shrugged and said, "You are his father, I don't care how you teach him, but if you are really stepped on by Emo Xiaobao in the future, don't expect me to lose face with you." Emo Xiaoyao reached out and pulled her into his embrace, saying with a smile, "Husband and wife are one. If I really lose face, then Li will also lose face. But if Emo Xiaobao wants to step on I'm afraid he still needs to train for a few more decades. And for Li's face, I will not lose face." Yili looked at him with a smile that was not a smile. "I only know that there is a saying that the river flows east for 10 years, then west for 10 years. There is also a saying that the back waves of the Yangtze River push on the front waves, and the front waves die on the beach. Prince, be careful." Emo Xiaobao was quick-witted. Being a member of both the Su family and the Prince Ding mansion, she felt that Emo Xiaobao would surpass Emo Xiaoyao in the future. "Haha, I also heard a saying that the older the ginger, the spicier it is," Emo Xiaoyao said with a smile. Inside Mo Xiaobao's tent, Mo Xiaobao was lying on the table, working hard to write. The bodyguard accompanying him looked at the little heir's face, which was sometimes twisted and sometimes laughed foolishly, and couldn't help but think, "Little heir, what are you doing?" Emo Xiaobao laughed strangely and flicked the letter in his hand. "I want eldest uncle to send me some books. From today onwards, this heir will study hard." The bodyguard turned his head and looked outside the half-closed tent, nodding. "It is cold enough now." Chapter 942. In the blink of an eye, it was already the Dechu State's New Year. Although they could not return home to reunite with their families, the Mahist army soldiers were still in high spirits as they prepared to slaughter chickens and goats to reward themselves. The entire Mahist army camp was more joyous than usual. In contrast to the joyous atmosphere of the Mahist army, the nearby royal house camp was gloomy and gloomy. Ever since the messenger sent by the king of the northern tribes was killed by Yelu Yi, there had been no news from the royal house of the northern tribes. After all, the royal house of the northern tribes was too far away from the Dechu state. However, Yelu Yi could clearly feel that the situation in the royal house of the northern tribes was extremely disadvantageous to him. Furthermore, the snow-covered plains made it impossible for the royal house of the northern tribes to transport their provisions to the Dechu state. In the previous few battles with the Mahist army seemed to have taken advantage of this weakness of the royal house of the northern tribes and specifically attacked their provisions. Although the royal house of the northern tribes would not run out of provisions in a short period of time, they were still very tight on provisions. Seeing the Mahist army soldiers celebrating and their laughter could be heard from the royal house of the northern tribes camp a few miles away, the comparison between the two made them feel even more disheartened and uneasy. In the royal house tent, Yaluyi looked at the generals below and frowned. He asked in a low voice, "Now that the two armies are in a deadlock and our morale is low, what good ideas do the generals have?" Helian stood up and said, "Your Highness, actually we don't need to be anxious." Yaluyi raised his brows and asked, "What does General Helian mean?" Helian smiled and said, "Because the Mahist army is more anxious than us. Genom of Gojoseon of Shilling is currently attacking Ruichang and Wei City. Prince Ding is rushing back to help. Mo Jingli of the Dechu State's army will arrive soon. When that time comes, the Mahist army will be completely trapped. If your Highness is anxious now, you will fall into their trap." Yaluyi asked solemnly, "Great General Helian, do you mean to drag it out?" Helian nodded and said, "That's right. As long as we wait for Manager Mo's troops to return to their positions, when the time comes, the three sides will attack together. Do you think we won't be able to deal with the Mahist army?" Yaluyi sneered and said, "Does General Helian think we have that much time?" How could Yaluyi not know what Helian was talking about? Others could wait, but he, Yaluyi, couldn't. If the war dragged on, even if he won in the end, the royal house of the northern tribes would be completely controlled by Yalu Hong. At that time, he would only be making a wedding dress for someone else. As one of Yaluyi's most trusted people, Helian naturally knew about the royal court's news. The current situation was truly a dilemma. If they fought head-on, they would definitely not be able to win against the Mahist army. However, if they continued to drag on like this, the Crown Prince Yalu Hong would gain the upper hand. His and the Seventh Prince's bitter battle would be in vain. In the end, they might not even be able to keep their lives. After Yaluyi dismissed all the generals, leaving only Helian and his son behind, Helian asked in a low voice, "Your Highness, what do you mean?" Yaluyi smiled bitterly. The Central Plains was vast and rich in resources. It was a place that the northern tribes had always coveted. Now that he had occupied this place, he naturally couldn't bear to give it up. However, was it worth it to give up the entire northern tribes for this place? If he could successfully conquer the entire Dechu state, then giving up the barren land of the northern tribes would naturally be worth it. However, the current situation in the Central Plains didn't seem to allow him to do so. More importantly, the soldiers under him were all born and raised in the northern tribes. Even if he broke off relations with the royal house of the northern tribes, these people might not be willing to leave their homes and stay in the Central Plains forever. On the other hand, if he retreated now and returned to the northern tribes, it could be said that the past few years of war would be completely wasted. All the military achievements of these few years would be reduced to nothing. Now that his imperial father was obviously dissatisfied with him, if he returned with his tail between his legs, it would obviously be disadvantageous to him. Yaluyi shook his head and smiled bitterly. "What meaning does I have now? It's already too late to back down now. Mo Xiaoyao is really I's nemesis. If it wasn't for Mo Xiaoyao, he would have already occupied half of the Dechu state. Even if his imperial father was dissatisfied with him, he was strong enough to stand on his own. But now, ever since Mo Xiaoyao left, the northern tribes' army had suffered defeat after defeat. Their morale was low, and the hearts of the people in the camp were wavering. Many soldiers were starting to miss the northern tribes' plains. In fact, Mo Xiaoyao wasn't just Yaluyi's nemesis. Mo Xiaoyao had only reappeared for 10 years. The originally strong Dechu state was in the south. The capital of Shilling was moved, and the imperial city was occupied. Ren Qining worked hard to build the northern tribes, but in less than 10 years, the country was destroyed. The reason why the royal house of the northern tribes wasn't affected by Mo Xiaoyao was because the royal house of the northern tribes was too far away from the Central Plains. Mo Xiaoyao didn't have the time or mood to stretch his hand so far. But now, in the conflict between Yaluyi and Yalu Hong, Mo Xiaoyao's shadow could be seen. Helian sighed and said, "The current situation is not good for us. I'm afraid your highness will have to make plans early. In fact, it was just one word: gamble. One bet was that the three allied armies could completely destroy the Prince Ding mansion and that the northern tribes could occupy half of the Dechu state. At that time, even if Yalu Yi broke off relations with the royal house of the northern tribes, he could still maintain his own military. The second bet was that the northern tribes would retreat and Yalu Yi would use the majority of the northern tribes' military power to fight with Yalu Hong. This was indeed a dilemma. At the side, Helian Peng said in a low voice, "Your Highness, Father, I'm afraid that even if we want to retreat now, the Mahist army may not allow it." The two of them looked at Helian Peng. Helian Peng said, "Your Highness and Father, have you forgotten that the northern tribes and the Prince Ding mansion have a deep hatred?" Hearing this, the two of them were shocked. In the war 10 years ago, not only did the Mahist army suffer, the northern tribes also suffered a great loss. But the Mahist army's hatred for the northern tribes would not be drowned out just because the northern tribes had also suffered a great loss. Mo Xiuyao's group had always been swift and decisive. In 3 months, they had taken down the emperor of Xiling City, and in a month, they had taken over the Chu capital. But this time, they had not been in a rush against the northern tribes. This was completely different from his usual style. Thinking of this, Helian Jun's heart sank. His expression changed, and he said, "Mo Xiuyao wants to wipe out the northern tribes in one fell swoop." Hearing this, Yalu Yi was also shocked. He said in a low voice, "Mo Xiuyao's appetite is too big." Helian Jin said, Mo Xiuyao was only 10 years old, and he had already mastered the art of war. His tactics were unfathomable. After 10 years of hiding his strength, I'm afraid that it is not simple. Your Highness, pay attention to the 2 wings of our army. If Mo Xiuyao really wants to wipe us out, he will definitely send troops to surround us from the 2 wings. He will also block our retreat. Yalu Yi knew that he was not as good as Helian Jun in terms of military strategy. He nodded and said, "I understand. Thank you for the reminder. But now it is difficult to advance, and we cannot retreat. What do the 2 of you think we should do?" Helian Peng said, "I think that since we cannot retreat, we should bravely advance. Furthermore, with the climate of the northern tribes, even if we retreat safely, the royal house of the northern tribes will need 2 to 3 months before the ice on the grasslands will melt. Since that is the case, why not take a gamble? King Ding's residents and the northern tribes have already become mortal enemies. If we break the agreement halfway, I'm afraid that the Western Hill will not let the northern tribes rest." Although the Western Hill was no longer connected to the northern tribes, the Western Hill was still a powerful country. Furthermore, the northern tribes were severely lacking in resources. Many of them had to be purchased from the Western Hill. If they offended 2 powerful enemies at the same time, the northern tribes would be in a dire situation. Chapter 943. Yalu Yi sighed and said, "Fine, General Helian and Uncle. What suggestions do you have?" Helian Jun pondered for a moment and said, "Tomorrow is the Dechu State's New Year. At that time, the entire Mahist army will celebrate. At that time, the Mahist army's guard will be at its lowest. Our army can take the opportunity to launch a sneak attack." "Will that work?" Yalu Yi was hesitant. Mo Xiuyao was one of the top generals in the world. Would he really make such a mistake? Helian Jun said, "Strike first and gain the upper hand. Our army's patience will only cause the Mahist army to retreat step by step. It will cause our army's morale to plummet." Yalu Yi pondered for a moment and sighed. "Let's do as Uncle says." In the Mo family army camp, the night was brightly lit, and the sounds of laughter were unceasing. Even the ban on alcohol that was strictly forbidden during the march was temporarily lifted. The entire military camp was filled with the strong aroma of alcohol. Dozens of soldiers were gathered around the bonfire, drinking wine and eating meat, having a great time. Mo Xiuyao and Yi Li also appeared in the camp with the other generals to drink with the soldiers. Although the winter was bitterly cold, the entire camp was lit with flames. The soldiers drank strong alcohol and did not feel the chill of winter at all. Even Mo Xiaobao sat beside Mo Xiaoyao and Yili. His delicate little face was filled with joy. In the dark night, a group of northern tribe soldiers quietly approached the Mahist army's camp. They could hear the cheers and noise from the Mahist army's camp from 3 to 4 li away. Also, the light from the bonfire lit up half the sky. This made the northern tribe soldiers who were ordered to launch a sneak attack feel even colder. They could not help but feel a strong sense of envy towards the Mahist army. What good fortune! We are starving and freezing here, but they are drinking and eating. A northern tribe's soldier shivered and complained in a low voice. The person beside him nodded in agreement. Isn't that so? The Mahist army is indeed much richer than us. It's rare for us to eat meat now. I heard that they still eat meat every day. Now that the road from the northern tribes to the Dechu state was blocked, the military supplies could not be transported over. Ever since the Mahist army started fighting with the northern tribes, many of the civilians who were originally under the control of the northern tribes ran over to the Mahist army. They could not even snatch anything from them. As a result, the rations in the army were severely reduced. Although there were many horses to the northern tribes, the most important thing was the horses. Therefore, unless it was absolutely necessary, it was absolutely not to be used to kill soldiers. Hence, these northern tribe soldiers who were used to eating meat and drinking wine could only learn from the people of the Central Plains and eat coarse grain to fill their stomachs. Once we take down the Mahist army camp, those things will naturally belong to us. Another northern tribe soldier said expectantly. That's right. If we snatch the rations of the Mahist army, we should also celebrate. The rest agreed. They were looking forward to snatching the rations of the Mahist army. The northern tribe soldiers who were preparing to launch a sneak attack waited for 2 to 4 hours outside the Mahist army camp. Only then did they see the lights of the Mahist army camp gradually dim. The noise from before also became much quieter. They knew that the Mahist army had finished celebrating and were preparing to rest. They had waited for half a night, waiting for the Mahist army to be drunk and tired before they could strike. Helian Peng, who was leading the troops, saw that the time had come. He softly ordered his subordinates to pass down the order. The northern tribe soldiers who were originally hiding in the snow immediately moved out and rushed towards the Mahist army camp. As they neared the Mahist army camp, Helian Peng saw that the Mahist army camp was already silent in the darkness and could not help but stop. The general beside him did not understand and softly asked, "General?" Helian Peng said in a deep voice, "Something is wrong." No matter how weak the Mo family army was, they shouldn't have been able to walk so close without any signs of movement. No matter how one looked at it, this was a trap. Hearing Helian Peng's words, everyone could not help but become nervous and vigilant. "General, are you saying?" Helian Peng had a bad feeling in his heart and decisively said, "Retreat." However, it was easy to think about it, but it was not so easy to leave. In the darkness, the surroundings suddenly lit up and a loud laugh came from not far away. "General Helian, since you are already here, why are you in such a hurry to leave?" The neat formation of the Mahist army suddenly rushed out from the shadows and surrounded the northern tribe's troops. A young general around the age of 27 or 28 rode out on his horse and looked at Helian Peng with a smile. "It's New Year's Eve. General Helian, are you here to give me a New Year's greeting?" Yun Ting. After these few days of fighting, Helian Peng naturally had a good understanding of the Mahist army's generals. He was also familiar with Yun Ting, the young general that Princess Ding had high hopes for. Yun Ting smiled proudly and said, "Yes, it is me. General Helian, have you been well these few days?" Helian Peng lowered his eyes and frowned slightly. Suddenly, his heart trembled and he raised his head and said, "You are the only one in the camp." The northern tribe's sneak attack was such a big matter, but only Yun Ting came out of the Mahist army. If it was not because the people from the Prince Ding mansion looked down on the northern tribes, then there was no one else in the Mahist army camp. Yun Ting was the only general here. Yun Ting did not try to hide it, smiling with some surprise as he said, "General Helian is indeed very perceptive." What he meant was that he was admitting that he, Yun Ting, was the only person in charge of the Mo family army's camp. However, Yunting's admission did not make Helianpeng happy. Instead, it made him even more restless. If there was only Yunting, Helianpeng might not be unable to take down the Mahist army camp. However, if it was just an empty camp, what was the use of taking it down? More importantly, where did Mo Xiaoyao and Yi Li bring the other generals? Compared to Helianpeng's gloomy and uncertain mood, Yunting was full of satisfaction. It was as if he was not worried about his mere few thousand men being surrounded by Helianpeng's army. He smiled and said, "General Helian, do you want to know the whereabouts of the prince and princess?" Helianpeng said in a low voice, "General Yun, please tell me." Didn't General Helian already guess? The prince and princess went to sneak attack the northern tribes' camp. Yunting laughed and said, "General Helian, do you think only the northern tribes know how to sneak attack? When it comes to the art of war, the people of the Central Plains are the ancestors." Helianpeng's face instantly turned green. Mo Xiaoyao and Yi Li had brought almost all the generals under the Mahist army to sneak attack the northern tribes' camp. It was obvious that they were determined to succeed. He turned around and shouted, "Retreat! Return to camp immediately." Yunting laughed coldly. "Do you think the Mahist army camp is a place where you can come and go as you please?" With a wave of his hand, the Mahist army had already blocked the path of the northern tribes' army. The location of the Mahist army's camp was very strange. If the northern tribes' army wanted to return, there was only one shortcut. However, that shortcut was blocked by the Mahist army that was lying in ambush. The other paths were not only difficult and treacherous, but they also had to take many detours. If Helianpeng wanted to return to reinforce the northern tribes' camp, he could only charge past Yunting. Chapter 944. However, Yunting joined the army when he was young. He followed Morongshen, Zhang Qilan, Lu Jingxian, and the others from an ordinary soldier to a young general who could lead an army by himself. For more than 10 years, he had participated in no less than 100 battles. How could it be so easy for Helianpeng to be favored? Yunting sat high on the horse and looked at Helianpeng with a smile. He said, "General Helian, don't be anxious. Let's exchange pointers first. You're courting death." Helianpeng was very confident in his martial arts. Even in the martial arts world of the Central Plains, there were few opponents, let alone a young general like Yunting. He raised the long saber in his hand and pounced on Yunting. When the two generals moved, the soldiers under them naturally did not hold back. They quickly tangled with each other in the midst of battle cries. Yunting grinned at Helianpeng, but did not fight him head-on. When he saw Helianpeng coming to kill him, he immediately pulled his horse and ran to the other side. Helianpeng caught up with Yunting in a few leaps. "Where do you think you're going?" Yunting turned around and smiled at him. "I know that General Helian's martial arts are excellent, so I specially invited a few masters to exchange pointers with you." As he spoke, a few black shadows appeared from the depths of the darkness. Helianpeng glanced at the dark patterns on the man in black's lapel and said in a deep voice, "Qilin."
Yes.
The leading man in black laughed in a low voice and raised his head. It was the third young master of the Su family, Su Qingfeng. Yunting got rid of Helianpeng and immediately cupped his hands to Su Qingfeng. He said with a smile, "Commander Su, I'll have to trouble you to take care of General Helian." After that, he lifted the reins and rushed into the battlefield again. Helianpeng's face was very ugly at this time. These days, Qilin of the Mahist army and his Yazi subordinates were also fighting openly and secretly. They had fought more than 10 times. However, Qilin rarely lost. On the contrary, the Yazi that he had high hopes for had almost been wiped out after a few months of fighting. Helianpeng also understood the difference between Qilin and Yazi. At the same time, he hated Princess Ding even more for training Qilin. At this moment, the people surrounding him were no match for him in a one-on-one fight. However, a swarm of them would also cause him to be flustered. Needless to say, these people didn't even need to kill him. They only needed to trap him for a few hours, and he wouldn't be able to go back to rescue them. Third Master Su? Helian-peng stared at Su Qingfeng and said, I didn't expect that the Su family's scholarly family would produce a military general like third young master. Su Qingfeng did not mind his mockery. With a leisurely laugh, he said, learning literature and martial arts is voluntary. Our Su family has never been demanding. Even if I throw away my pen and join the army, I won't disgrace the Su family's martyrs. Although Su Qingfeng liked martial arts, he grew up in the Su family. He had been influenced by poetry since he was young. Although his talent was not as good as the Su family's, he was much better than the average person. Moreover, Su Qingfeng had never regretted his choice, nor did he think that he had made a mistake. Helian-peng's words were not even qualified to scratch his itch. Helian-peng also knew that this situation was more or less useless. It was better to get rid of Qilin's siege as soon as possible and lead the troops back to rescue them. With a serious expression, he said in a deep voice, then, this general would like to experience Qilin's skills. Su Qingfeng and the others did not say much. They directly took out their weapons and went up to fight. The strength of Qilin and the others was their teamwork. Although they were not as strong individually, with a few people surrounding them, Helian-peng could only be suppressed. On the other side, Enchanting led his soldiers and rampaged through the chaotic army. Many northern tribe soldiers who did not have time to react were killed. The mountains were filled with murderous cries. At this time, Yi Li and Mo Xiaoyao had already appeared not far from the northern tribe's camp. Looking at the brightly lit northern tribe's camp, Mo Xiaoyao's lips curled into a cold smile. It was obvious that Yelu Yi and the others were still waiting for news from Helian-peng. What Yelu Yi didn't expect was that the person they wanted to ambush had already appeared in front of them with a group of people. Yi Li urged her horse to stand beside Mo Xiaoyao and looked at the camp with him. She smiled faintly and said, Helian-peng must have already started fighting with Enchanting. As long as Helian-peng and Enchanting started fighting, it would be impossible for them to retreat for a while. They would also have enough time to deal with Yelu Yi and Helian-zhen. Mo Xiaoyao nodded and said, that's right. I wonder if Helian-zhen will think that I am outside his camp right now. On the other side, Feng Jiao smiled and said, Helian-zhen must think that Prince was really shocked by Helian-peng's sudden attack. Originally, the Mahist army's celebration was just a trap for the northern tribes. With Mo Xiaoyao's personality, how could he be so conceited that the entire army would celebrate when he had yet to achieve complete victory? It was a pity that Helian-zhen did not understand Mo Xiaoyao's character at all. Are you ready? Mo Xiaoyao asked calmly. Feng Jiao nodded and said, yes, Sun Yao will lead the troops to the left, and Qin Yun will lead the troops to the right. Zhoumin has already led the troops to Huifeng Valley. We will attack from the front. After 2 hours, Enchanting will let Helian-peng out to meet with Yelu Yi and the others. I guarantee that not a single northern tribe's soldier will escape. Mo Xiaoyao nodded and praised. Very good. I want to see if Helian-zhen still has the power to turn the situation around. Although he was smiling, Mo Xiaoyao's words were filled with a cold, killing intent. Prince, should we attack now? Feng Jiao was also eager to give it a try. Let's do it. Mo Xiaoyao nodded and said. Feng Jiao smiled and took out an arrow from his back. He knocked it and pulled the bowstring. A long arrow with a fiery glow shot towards the northern tribe's camp. Chapter 945. In the northern tribe's main tent, Yelu Yi and Helian-zhen were sitting inside. Helian-zhen's expression was solemn and he was silent. Yelu Yi was pacing back and forth in the main tent. His sharp brows were tightly knitted together. His face was also vaguely anxious and uneasy. After pacing back and forth for a long time, Yelu Yi squatted down and looked at Helian-zhen. Uncle, will there be any problems with General Helian? Helian-zhen calmed himself down and said in a low voice, Your Highness, please be patient. Peng did not send any bad news. We must not panic. Yelu Yi nodded and was silent for a long time before he said, I don't know why, but I feel uneasy. Helian-zhen was silent. He did not know if he was too worried or if something had really happened. Yalu Yi was not the only one who felt uneasy. Even Helian Jun felt that something was wrong. After thinking for a while, Helian Jun stood up and said, "I will send people to investigate." Yalu Yi nodded and said, "Uncle, send more people. No matter what news there is, let them report back as soon as possible."
Yes.
Helian Jun replied, and turned to leave the tent. The moment Helian Jun walked out of the tent, he saw a flame shoot in from outside the tent and landed in the northern tribe camp. It landed on one of the tents. Even though it was winter and many of the tents were covered with a layer of frost and did not burn immediately, it still shocked many people. Helian Jun was stunned for a moment before he reacted and shouted, "Enemy attack!" Yalu Yi, who was originally in the tent, heard his voice and immediately rushed out. He said in a low voice, "What's going on?" Helian Jun's eyes were slightly red. He said, "The Mahist army is outside the camp. Defend!" That fire arrow had caused an uproar in the northern tribe's camp. After a while, the low sound of a bugle horn could be heard in the camp. All the soldiers immediately picked up their weapons and rushed out of their tents to defend. Unfortunately, as soon as the soldiers at the front appeared outside the gate, they were greeted with a rain of arrows that blotted out the sky and covered the earth. In the darkness, the enemy was in the dark while they were in the light. They could only see clearly when the arrows were right in front of them. "It's the Mahist army!" someone shouted. The entire northern tribe's encampment was thrown into chaos. Helian Jun's anger flared up. He loudly ordered the generals to lead the soldiers to defend against the enemy. Not far from the northern tribe's camp, Mo Xiaoyao and Yi Li were riding on horseback. Behind them were Feng Jiao, Zhu Jing, Lin Han, and the rest. Seeing that the Mahist army had caught the northern tribe's army off guard, everyone was in a good mood. Xiaobao sat in front of Mo Xiaoyao, covered by the large battle robe, only revealing his small head. A pair of bright eyes stared at the northern tribe's camp, which was filled with cries of slaughter. It was obvious that she was watching with great interest. After these few days of losses, the northern tribe's army's numbers were almost the same as the Mahist army's. Now that most of the northern tribe's troops had been taken away by Helian Peng, the northern tribe's troops were even lesser than the Mahist army. Under the sudden attack, the northern tribe's army was defeated even more quickly. In less than an hour, the entire situation started to favor the Mahist army. Helian Jun brought his soldiers to support Yalu Yi. As they retreated, he turned back and said to Yalu Yi, "Your Highness, we have been fooled. Peng might not be able to make it back in time. Let's retreat first." "Retreat? Where else can we retreat to?" Yalu Yi led the way. He was not saying it out of anger. They were now less than 200 miles away from the northern tribe's border. If they retreated any further, they would really have to retreat back into the northern tribe's territory. It also indicated that the war against Great Chu, which had lasted for 2 to 3 years and started with great vigor, would end in the most humiliating ending. Yalu Yi was naturally unwilling, but the current situation did not allow him to be unwilling. They could either retreat or fight to the death and wait for Helian Peng's return. But regardless of whether Helian Peng could return, the price of fighting to the death was not something Yalu Yi was willing to bear. He glared fiercely in the direction of the Mahist army commander and said hatefully, "Retreat." The bugle horn for retreat sounded in the dark night. The already low morale of the northern tribe's soldiers immediately retreated in the direction Yalu Yi had left in. Although the Mahist army soldiers were chasing behind, they did not close in on them. They only maintained a steady pace. Helian Jun felt that something was wrong, but the current situation only gave him 2 options. He could either move forward or turn back. They naturally could not turn back and fight the Mahist army head-on. They could only move forward. On the other side, Helian Peng, who was surrounded by the Qi Lin, finally managed to escape after 2 hours. When he finally managed to break through the encirclement of Yun Ting's army, the eastern sky was already turning bright. Behind him, Yun Ting and the rest looked in the direction of the northern tribe's army and smiled faintly. One of the Qi Lin said sullenly, "Why didn't we kill him? Why did we let him go?" Although Helian Peng's martial arts were indeed very powerful, it was not the most powerful for the well-trained Qilin, who already had many experiences in fighting against experts. It was only a matter of time before they took his life. Su Qingfeng patted his subordinate's head and said, "Since the prince has given the order, he naturally has his reasons. Let's go. We can't miss the show." Everyone agreed in unison. After packing up, they chased after Helian Peng's army. By the time Helian Peng met up with Yelu Yi and the rest, the sky was already bright. Although they could not see clearly due to the thick fog in the morning and almost killed each other, they still managed to meet up. It was not safe to stay in such an unfamiliar foggy environment. However, the northern tribe's soldiers were exhausted after fighting for half a night. Helian Zhen had no choice but to find an open area to rest for a while. After counting the number of soldiers, the three of them turned pale. There were originally a few 100,000 soldiers left, but after a night of fighting, there were less than 200,000 left. At least 90% of the soldiers were brought back by Helian Peng. The soldiers that were left behind to guard the camp were almost completely wiped out. Helian Zhen looked gloomily at Yelu Yi, who was sitting at the side in a daze. He looked at Helian Peng and said, "Peng, how did you find us?" Helian Peng frowned and said in a low voice, "After I killed my way out of Yun Ting's army, I found 4 to 5 groups of Mahist army to intercept me. I fought my way here and coincidentally met Father and Your Highness." Helian Zhen frowned and said in a low voice, "This is not right. We were running in front, and the Mahist army was chasing us from behind. Even if we lost our way, we couldn't have gone too far. How did you coincidentally meet us while being chased?" Helian Peng's heart skipped a beat, and he suddenly jumped up and said, "Father." Helian Zhen looked at him, and Helian Peng's expression was gloomy. He gritted his teeth and said, "We fell into Mo Xiaoyao's traps." Helian Zhen was stunned, and his expression changed. He grabbed Helian Peng and said quickly, "You mean?" Chapter 946. Haha, General Helian, don't you think it's too late for you to understand now? In the thick fog, a joyful and low voice sounded from afar. When the voice first sounded, it was clearly very far away. However, when the voice was about to fade away, it seemed to be right in front of them. Helian Zhen and the rest looked towards the source of the voice. Not far away, where the thick fog had dispersed, a white-robed and white-haired figure appeared abruptly. The expression on his face could not be seen clearly due to the faint fog, but Helian Peng and Helian Zhen could clearly feel that he was smiling, and it was an extremely cold smile. "Mo Xiaoyao." Helian Zhen gritted his teeth and said, "That's I." After 19 years, it's not easy to invite General Helian back to Wind Valley. Mo Xiaoyao was dressed in white, his white hair fluttering in the cold wind. His lips curled into a faint smile, but the words that came out of his mouth inexplicably made people feel a kind of chilling murderous intent. "This is Wind Valley?" Helian Zhen exclaimed in shock. Mo Xiaoyao smiled and said, "Isn't it? I didn't expect General Helian to have forgotten about it in less than 20 years. However, I also feel that Ghost Valley must have left a deep impression on General Helian. It's a pity that I can't invite General Helian back to Ghost Valley this time." Wind Valley was the place where the Mahist army was buried by Helian Zhen. Even the Prince Ding mansion's former Prince Ding, Mo Xiaoyan, had died not far from here. Ghost Valley was less than 50 li away from Wind Valley. It was the place where Mo Xiaoyao had defeated Helian Zhen with a fire, and where Mo Xiaoyao himself had been severely injured. These two places were unforgettable to both parties who had participated in the war. As Mo Xiaoyao spoke, countless Mahist army had already surrounded them from all directions. In the fog, one could vaguely see countless black shadows moving about. It was as cold and ethereal as the netherworld, causing the tired and hungry northern tribe's soldiers to be even more frightened. Behind Mo Xiaoyao, a few figures gradually appeared. Yili, Yunting and the rest in white, young Master Feng San in red, and Su Qingfeng, Zhuijing, Lin Han, and the rest in black. They were all eyeing the northern tribe's soldiers below. Only Mo Xiaobao, who was wearing a black brocade robe and standing beside Yili, seemed to be in high spirits even though he hadn't slept the entire night. She opened her big round eyes and looked curiously at the people below. Looking at the serious faces of the people around her, she curiously tugged at Feng Jiao's clothes. Feng Jiao quietly shook his head at Emo Xiaoyao and gave Emo Xiaoyao a look. Emo Xiaobao pursed his lips and quietly moved to Emo Xiaoyao's side. Lord Father. Emo Xiaoyao smiled faintly and bent down to carry Emo Xiaobao. He smiled and said, Yuchen, do you know where this place is? This was the first time Emo Xiaoyao called his name so seriously. Emo Xiaobao blinked and asked curiously, Lord Father, where is this place? This is the place where the martyrs of the Mahist army and your uncle were buried. Emo Xiaoyao said in a low voice. Emo Xiaobao blinked. Although he was young, he was naturally taught the history of the Mahist army and the Princeton mansion. Naturally, he also knew that he had an uncle whom Lord Father respected very much who was killed by the northern tribes. In the past, Emo Xiaobao secretly thought that if his uncle didn't die, would there be one more person to help him when Lord Father bullied him? Lord Father, are we going to take revenge for uncle? Emo Xiaobao asked with wide eyes. That's right. Emo Xiaoyao said in a low voice. Feng Jiao and the rest who were following behind Emo Xiaoyao couldn't help but glance at Yili. The little prince wasn't even 8 years old yet. Wasn't it a little too perverted to let a child like him watch such a scene? Yili sighed helplessly. Looking at Emo Xiaobao's excited appearance, it didn't seem like he was afraid at all. Yili was also worried that her obedient son would be taught astray by Emo Xiaoyao. But no matter how close Emo Xiaobao was to Yili, boys were naturally more obedient to their father in certain aspects.
For example, right now.
Yalui stepped out from the northern tribe's army, his face ashen as he stared at Emo Xiaoyao and said in a low voice, Prince Ding, good strategy, good patience. At this point, how could Yalui not know that Emo Xiaoyao had been toying with them all this time? His ultimate goal was to force the northern tribe's army to return Wind Valley to take revenge on Emo Xiaoyin for being plotted against. Emo Xiaoyao smiled and nodded, well said. Even if 7th Highness brings a group of defeated soldiers back to the northern tribes, you will definitely not be Yalu Crown Prince's match. You might as well die and return Wind Valley and preserve 7th Highness' reputation. 7th Highness should be thanking Yalu Ye's expression twisted. Even ants wanted to live, what more humans? Yalu Ye wasn't afraid of death, but he definitely wasn't willing to die like this. But he also understood that their current situation wasn't up to him to decide. With hundreds of thousands of Mahist army surrounding them, they had less than 200,000 soldiers. Even if they gave it their all, they wouldn't be able to escape. As long as Emo Xiaoyao gave the order, tens of thousands of arrows would shoot and the northern tribe's army would be buried in an instant. Helian Jun's face was pale as he remained silent. Helian Peng stood beside Yaluyi, his gaze like an arrow as he stared at Yili, who was beside Emo Xiaoyao. I am Helian Peng. Please battle with Princess Ding. Helian Peng suddenly took a step forward and said in a low voice. The Mahist army generals all looked at Helian Peng as if they were looking at an idiot. Wanting to challenge Princess Ding in front of Prince Ding, this guy must be crazy. As expected, Emo Xiaoyao laughed coldly and said indifferently, General Helian, why don't you challenge I? Are you looking down on I? Helian Peng glanced at Emo Xiaoyao but didn't reply, only staring at Yili. Yili smiled faintly and took a step forward. Since General Helian is interested, this consort will naturally accompany you. Please. Although Yili didn't have a good impression of Helian Peng was a general of a country and naturally knew that challenging a female in front of so many people wasn't something to be proud of. Knowing that he was going to die, he still persisted. At least this proved that Helian Peng really saw Yili as an opponent. Princess Li, Emo Xiaoyao frowned slightly. Yi Li's internal energy was much weaker than Helian Peng's. Although he was confident that Yi Li's life wouldn't be in danger with him around, he couldn't guarantee that Yi Li wouldn't be injured. Yi Li shook her head and smiled. It'll be fine. Yi Li took a few steps forward, and a silver light flashed in her sleeve. A short blade glittering with cold light appeared in Yi Li's hand. On the opposite side, Helian Peng held a long blade in his hand. Just looking at the weapons made people feel that the two of them weren't on equal footing. Helian Peng didn't hold back and slashed the long blade in his hand towards Yi Li. Yi Li stepped sideways and dodged the blade. Bai Sei's voice was like a swan as it flew towards Helian Peng. In the faint fog, the crowd could only see two silhouettes coming and going. The sound of weapons clashing could be heard continuously. Yi Li, who was fighting with Helian Peng, frowned slightly. In terms of strength and internal energy, she was definitely no match for Helian Peng. Just now, the short blade and the long blade clashed several times. Yi Li's right hand felt numb from the vibrations. She didn't want to fight with Helian Peng head-on anymore. She quickly closed in on Helian Peng and fought in close combat. As a result, Helian Peng's long blade was useless. He tried to distance himself from Yi Li a few times but failed. In terms of close combat, there weren't many people in the world who were Yi Li's match. If she didn't use her internal energy, even Mo Xiaoyao might not be able to gain much of an advantage. As a result, the two of them were evenly matched. Chapter 947. The two of them fought for close to 100 moves, but neither of them gained the upper hand. Helian Peng's expression darkened. His powerful internal energy gathered in his palm as he sent a palm strike towards Yi Li. Yi Li reacted even faster. She drew a sharp blade from her left sleeve and stabbed it towards Helian Peng's abdomen without hesitation. At the same time, she leaned to the side to avoid Helian Peng's palm strike. Helian Peng wholeheartedly wanted to heavily injure Yi Li. He actually ignored Yi Li's approaching dagger. At the same time that his abdomen hurt, his palm strike also landed on Yi Li's body. Even though Yi Li leaned to the side to avoid it, she still received a trace of internal injury. She turned around to withdraw her dagger and quickly retreated. When Yi Li pulled out her dagger, Helian Peng realized that something was wrong. Yi Li's dagger was specially made to be used as a military knife. There was a blood groove in the middle. As long as it touched the body, it would bleed incessantly. Last time, Helian Peng injured his arm and took a long time to recover. This time, his abdomen was even more so. However, Helian Peng knew that this time, if he fell into Mo Xiaoyao's hands, there was no chance of survival. As long as he could kill or heavily injure Yi Li, why would he care if he bled to death? Yi Li retreated to a distance and stood still. A trace of dark red blood flowed from the corner of her mouth. Helian Peng stood still with his long blade propped up. Blood flowed from his abdomen. Yi Li casually wiped the blood from the corner of her mouth and said indifferently, "General Helian, thank you for letting me win." Helian Peng sneered. He actually threw away his long blade and pounced towards Yi Li. Yi Li's eyes flashed. The short blade in her right hand flashed with a cold light. Like a white rainbow, it swept past Helian Peng's side. The two people only crossed paths for a moment before they separated again. Yi Li turned around. On the other side, Helian Peng had already silently collapsed. A thin line of blood slowly blossomed on his throat. "Peng, Helian Jun screamed. Even though Helian Peng was only his adopted son, he had raised him from a young age. What's more, Helian Jun himself didn't have any children, so Helian Peng was no different from his own son. In this world, other than Yalu Yi, Helian Jun valued Helian Peng the most. Seeing him die at the hands of Yi Li, she was naturally filled with grief. She threw herself onto Helian Peng's body and cried bitterly. She raised her head and glared fiercely at Yi Li. Yi Li wiped the blood off the dagger and walked back to Mo Xiaoyao's side. Mo Xiaoyao was relieved to see that her injuries were not serious. The moment they met, the Northern Tribe's army lost their most skilled fighter, Helian Peng. This made the already low morale of the Northern Tribe's army even worse. Yaluyi glanced at the soldiers around him, feeling defeated, and smiled bitterly. At this moment, the fog in the surroundings had gradually dissipated, and the black mass of Mahist army soldiers could be seen everywhere. In this situation, they couldn't even make a move, let alone charge out. "I have lost. What does Prince Ding want?" Yeluyi closed his eyes and asked coldly. Mo Xiaoyao smiled faintly. What does I want? Does General Helian not know? Hearing this, Helian Peng's expression changed. Mo Xiaoyao, you. Helian Peng couldn't help but think of the two fires from 19 years ago. One was at Huifeng Valley. It was here that he saw countless Mahist army die tragically in the fire. The first battle was at the Ghost Sorrow Valley. The Mo family army and the northern tribes both suffered heavy losses. Mo Xiaoyao was heavily injured and almost lost his life. The northern tribes suffered heavy losses and almost collapsed.
But now,
Mo Xiaoyao actually wanted to. Prince Ding, the seventh prince, has already admitted defeat. Helian Zhen was too proud to say the word surrender. He could only follow Yelu Ye's instructions and admit defeat. So what? Mo Xiaoyao raised his eyebrows. I have waited for this day for 19 years. In this Huifeng Valley, I will pay tribute to the souls of the Mahist army. So, whether you surrender or not, all northern tribe soldiers who step into the Chu state must die. How could Yelu Yi not understand Mo Xiaoyao's intentions after listening to the conversation between the two? Mo Xiaoyao actually wanted to burn all of them to death in Huifeng Valley to avenge the Mahist army that died here more than 10 years ago. Yelu Yi only felt a slight pain in his throat. He stepped forward and gritted his teeth. Prince Ding, I have lost. Regardless of life or death, I am at Prince Ding's disposal. However, I hope that Prince Ding will let these northern tribe soldiers go. They were only following orders. Behind Mo Xiaoyao, Feng Jiao laughed coldly. What Prince Yelu means is that the people behind you did not kill the innocent people of the Central Plains. Yelu Yi was speechless. The north of De Chu State was filled with rivers of blood. Most of them were the lives of the commoners of De Chu State. 9 out of 10 houses in the north were empty. Under such circumstances, Yelu Yi had no way to argue. Mo Xiaoyao laughed coldly and raised his hand. Release the arrows. The surrounding Mahist army drew their bows and arrows rained down. Mo Xiaoyao, you have gone too far. Helian Zhen roared. Charge out. Even a cornered beast would put up a fight, let alone a human. Although these northern tribe soldiers were already exhausted, they had no choice but to fight in the face of life and death. Their eyes were almost red as they rushed towards the north. Seeing the actions of the northern tribe's army, Mo Xiaoyao's lips curled into a cold smile. Feng Jiao waved the black flag in his hand, and the Mahist army began to retaliate. However, there was a slight opening in the northwest direction for the remaining northern tribe soldiers to pass through. Mo Xiaoyao and the rest did not chase after them. Instead, they stood there calmly and looked in the direction of the northern tribe soldiers.
Boom.
With a loud explosion, a red light shot into the sky from the northwest direction. In an instant, almost half the sky was dyed red. Faint cries of agony could be heard from the northwest direction. It was almost unbearable to hear. Yili stood silently beside Mo Xiaoyao. In the end, she could not help but close her eyes and cover Mo Xiaobao's ears. However, Mo Xiaobao refused to be obedient and grabbed Yili's hand. Although the cries of agony were terrifying to him, he knew that his father was taking revenge for the dead Mahist army and his uncle. Children were always naive and cruel. In their eyes, there was only right and wrong. Since it was right, there was no need to be afraid or even pity. Feng Jiao silently looked at the red light shooting into the sky. He had also participated in the battle more than 10 years ago. Although he did not make it to Huifeng Valley, when he and Mo Xiaoyao arrived, they still saw the tragic state of the soldiers who died there. No, they did not even die in battle. They died in vain. Just like Mo Xiaoyao, Feng Jiao had never forgotten in the past 19 years. Just like how the souls of the Mahist army had never been able to rest in peace. Until now, the 200,000 soldiers of the northern tribes were sacrificing the souls of the Mahist army. May the ancestors rest in peace. Chapter 948. The war that had lasted for half a year came to an abrupt end just like that. The last few 100,000 northern tribe soldiers were all buried in Huifeng Valley. The entire valley was covered in blood, and corpses were everywhere. As for the scattered northern tribe soldiers who were stationed in various places, they were naturally not worth mentioning. They were all wiped out by the Mahist army at lightning speed. This battle seemed neither surprising nor exciting and unremarkable. However, in terms of battle results, it was enough to erase most of the records in the history of the Mahist army. Out of more than 1,000,000 northern tribe soldiers, not a single one managed to escape. After this battle, the northern tribes had not only lost more than 1,000,000 soldiers and horses, but also nearly 70% of their generals. They would definitely not be able to recover without a few decades. When the battlefield was cleaned up, the person who was escorted by the Mahist army to Immerse, and the rest surprised everyone. This person was none other than the winged cavalry general of the northern tribes, Helianjin. Even Yalu Yi had died in the chaos. No one had expected Helianjin to still be alive. Immerse's handsome eyes darkened slightly as he glanced at the two soldiers who escorted Helianjin over. The two of them hurriedly reported, "Prince, this person said that he has important news regarding the northern tribes to tell you." That's why. Everyone understood that at the last moment, Helianjin was afraid of death and could only use this to exchange for a chance to save his life. Regarding this, the Mahist army generals not only looked at him with contempt, but also with hatred. 19 years ago, those Mahist army soldiers who died in vain did not even die at the hands of an indomitable hero. They died at the hands of a cowardly and shameless person. In fact, 19 years ago, Helianjin was not necessarily a cowardly person. However, he had not been on the battlefield for more than a decade. Even when he was defeated by Immerse, he was far from being at his peak. After more than a decade, his original mentality and courage had long been worn away. All that was left was his unwillingness to lose to Immerse. When reality proved that he was indeed unable to defeat Immerse, even this bit of unwillingness disappeared. All that was left was his life. "Prince Ding, as long as you spare my life, I am willing to tell you the distribution of the northern tribes' forces." Helianjin's eyes were blazing as he said anxiously. He didn't want to die. Even 19 years ago, he wasn't so clear that he didn't want to die. Immerse's lips curled into a disdainful sneer. "General Helian, you haven't held military power for 19 years. Do you really know the distribution of the northern tribes' military strength?" Helianjin was speechless. I can tell you everything I know, as long as you spare my life." At this time, Helianjin finally realized that he didn't have the ability to negotiate with Immerse, and said somewhat frantically. The killing intent in Immerse's eyes surged, but he did not act out immediately. He slowly closed his eyes and calmed his emotions. When he opened his eyes again, he was completely calm. However, Helianjin faintly felt that something was wrong. Immerse's voice was as calm as still water. "Drag him out and execute him." "Yes." The two soldiers who escorted Helianjin in did not hesitate and dragged him out again. Hearing Helianjin's frantic cries and pleas as he was dragged out, everyone felt a little sad for him. A famous general of a generation. Even though his reputation was tarnished, he still couldn't escape death. There was a moment of silence in the tent, and everyone's expression was a little dazed. Yun Ting and the other young generals could not believe that they had really annihilated the northern tribes, who had more soldiers and horses than them and were comparable in strength. Sun Yao was stunned for a moment, then suddenly burst into tears. Although he did not have the enmity with the northern tribes, 3 years ago, the northern tribes invaded the Dechu state and killed countless people. Sun Yao's hatred for the northern tribes was not inferior to the Mahist army's elders. Zhoumin patted Sun Yao's shoulder and laughed. "Old Sun, you cry too much. Isn't it a good thing that we won?" Sun Yao wiped his eyes and said angrily, "What do you know? I'm just happy, you know?" Zhoumin rubbed her nose and decided not to lower herself to the same level as this boar. Immerse's expression was calm as he said in a low voice, "All right, everyone reorganize and rest for 2 days. Zhoumin, Sun Yao." "Here." Zhoumin immediately stood up and replied loudly. Sun Yao also quickly stood up. Mo Xiaoyao said, I'll leave the border to the two of you. The rest of you, head south in 2 days. Yes, General. Everyone replied in unison. The Chu state's northern border was extremely long, and only Zhou Min and Sun Yao were leading an army alone for the first time. One of them was originally only a general of a province, and it was definitely not enough. However, it was currently winter, and even if the northern tribes wanted to send reinforcements or take revenge for Yiluyi, it would be 2 months later. Moreover, after half a year of experience, the two of them were able to take on big responsibilities, so Mo Xiaoyao was not worried. Zhou Min was naturally happy to accept the order, and Sun Yao, as a surrendered general, was also very happy that Prince Ding trusted him so much. They accepted the order happily. The others also understood that they would be following Prince Ding to the south, and there would be countless fierce battles ahead. At the same time, it also meant that there would be more merits to be gained, so they were also looking forward to it. In a short time, the atmosphere in the tent became lively. Yili sat beside Mo Xiaoyao and quietly reached out to hold Mo Xiaoyao's hand. Mo Xiaoyao looked sideways at the smiling Yili beside him, his eyes filled with warmth and a smile. At the same time, he tightly held Yi Li's hand. Mo Xiaobao sat between the two of them, looking left and right at his father and mother. He also smiled and covered their hands with his own. On a small hill not far from Huifeng Valley, there was an inconspicuous lone grave. There was not even a tombstone in front of the lone grave, and the grave was covered with withered grass. If one did not pay attention, they would even think that this was really a small hill full of withered grass. Mo Xiaoyao held Yi Li's hand with one hand and Mo Xiaobao with the other hand, standing in front of the grave. Yi Li looked at Mo Xiaoyao with some confusion, and a trace of understanding flashed through her eyes. Mo Xiaoyao said softly, Li, this is Big Brother. Yi Li did not ask much, nodded, and went forward to bow, saying, Sister-in-law Yi Li greets elder brother. Then she turned to Mo Xiaobao and said, Xiaobao, kowtow to uncle. Mo Xiaobao blinked blankly. Although he did not understand why he had already seen his uncle's grave in the Chu capital, and now there was another one here, he still obediently walked to Yi Li's side and knelt down, respectfully kowtowing 3 times, saying, Mo Yuchen kowtows to uncle. Mo Xiaoyao sighed slightly, lifted his clothes and knelt beside Yi Li, saying in a low voice, Big brother, do you see? I have avenged you. Yi Li turned slightly and found that the position of the grave was facing Huifeng Valley. If one stood here alone, then they would have seen everything that happened in Huifeng Valley yesterday clearly. Mo Xiaowen had brought up Mo Xiaoyao when he was young, so he was naturally very respectful to this elder brother. So after so many years, Mo Xiaoyao had never forgotten to avenge his elder brother. But no one thought that Mo Xiaoyao would actually bury Mo Xiaowen in such a remote and desolate place far from the Chu capital. Chapter 949. After kowtowing, Mo Xiaoyao helped Yi Li up and sat down at a place not far away from the grave. He held Yi Li's shoulder and said leisurely, Everyone thought that eldest brother's remains were buried in the ancestral grave of King Ding's residence in the capital. But that's not the case. That year when I rushed to the border, Big Brother's remains had already been cremated. So, I replaced him. Big Brother's real remains are buried here. I want him to stay here and watch. One day, I will take revenge for him and the soldiers of the Mo family army who died in vain. Yi Li held his hand and smiled. You did it. Big Brother will be very happy. Mo Xiaoyao was a little confused. I don't know if Big Brother will be happy. But Big Brother will never come back. He had always wanted to take revenge, but when it was time to take revenge, his heart was filled with loneliness and emptiness. When Mo Jingqi died, Mo Xiaoyao already had this feeling. Now this feeling of emptiness was even stronger, because even if he killed all his enemies, the dead would never come back. Xiaoyao. Yi Li called out worriedly. Mo Xiaoyao smiled faintly. Don't worry, I still have you, the Prince Ding mansion and the Mahist army. holding Yi Li's hand with a smile, and looking at the rarely seen obedient Emo Xiaobao beside him, Emo Xiaoyao felt warmth in his heart. Luckily, there was Li, their child, and their family. Otherwise, Emo Xiaoyao would not know what to do with his life after taking revenge. Emo Xiaobao pouted, his eyes turning as he threw himself into Emo Xiaoyao's arms. "Father, you still have me and my little brother and sister. When I grow up, I will help you destroy the northern tribes." Emo Xiaoyao looked at him with a smile that was not a smile. "Is that so? I'll be waiting." Emo Xiaobao snorted unhappily. "Imperial father is looking down on me. Just you wait. When I grow up, I will definitely destroy the northern tribes for you to see." Emo Xiaoyao nodded and said, "That's right. Aren't I just waiting to see?" Emo Xiaobao deeply felt that he was being looked down upon by his father. He was so angry that he started shouting. Grabbing onto Emo Xiaoyao and refusing to let go, Yi Li couldn't help but smile as she watched the father and son quarrel. She said softly, "Do you want to move Big Brother's remains back to the Chu capitals?" Emo Xiaoyao shook his head and smiled. "No need. Just stay here. In the future, the Emo family's ancestral grave might not be in the Chu capital. Moreover, it was much quieter here. Don't you see that there aren't many nobles, generals, ministers, and emperors' mausoleums, all of them dazzling with gold and jade and rich enough to rival a country? Waiting for the rise and fall of the dynasty would only benefit the grave robbers." In the past year, there had been many major events. At the end of the year, the regent of the Chu state, Emo Jingli, who had settled down in Jiangnan, finally ascended the throne. Before the end of the year, there was another earth-shattering event in the north. The million-strong army that attacked the Chu state was completely destroyed by the Maoist army. Not a single person returned to the northern tribes. When this news came out, the world was shocked. Many citizens of the Chu state who had been forced to move were in tears, secretly planning to return to the north. Unfortunately, although the northern tribes had been destroyed, the north was still fighting. The king of Chu, Emo Jingli, who had ascended the throne less than half a month ago, led 700,000 troops to the north, vowing to reclaim the land. At this time, the Shilling army led by Enchanting had already broken through Ruichang and surrounded Wei City. Wei City was in danger. Wei City. On the city gate tower, Marquis Nan and Murong sat facing each other, each playing a game of chess. Below the city gate tower, several li away, was the Shilling army's camp. Banners could be seen fluttering in the army camp. Even from afar, one could feel a monstrous fighting spirit. Murong shook his head and helplessly threw down a chess piece, saying, "Marquis Nan, you can really keep your composure. I've never liked these things." Marquis Nan looked up and smiled, saying, "General Murong, please be patient." Murong said impatiently, "Ruichang has already been lost. Now that Enchanting's army has surrounded Wei City, we can't do anything. How can I be patient?" Marquis Nan smiled, saying, "The situation is much better than expected, isn't it? Master, I originally said that it would be good if we could defend Feihong Pass in 3 months. Now it's been more than 2 months, and Wei City is still in our hands. This means that the situation is not beyond Prince's expectations. Our military strength is not as good as Enchanting's, and our military strategy is also inferior to his. General Murong, why do you blame yourself?" Murong sighed and looked at Marquis Nan embarrassedly, saying, "It's me who can't bear it. I've been on the battlefield for half my life. It's the first time that I've been suppressed and beaten without any resistance." Murong had fought hundreds of battles in his life. Of course, there were victories and defeats. But this was the first time that he had been beaten to the point of being unable to raise his head. It was inevitable that he was upset. Marquis Nan smiled, saying, "Enchanting is known as the West Hill War God. In his life, he has only been defeated by the former Prince Regent and the current Princess Ding. If it weren't for him, why would Prince take the risk of destroying the northern tribes first so that he could focus on Enchanting?" As for Emo Jingli's De Chu state, to be honest, the Maoist army did not really care about it. Half of De Chu state's famous generals were now in the Prince Ding mansion. In these years, They had not heard of any outstanding young generals. Mo Jingli was not inferior to Mo Jingqi's paranoia. He would only firmly hold the military power in his hands to prevent a second Prince Ding mansion from appearing in Chu state to take away his military power. Murong nodded, saying, "Thank you for your reminder, Marquis Nan." Marquis Nan patted his shoulder and smiled, saying, "Just relax. No matter what, we have to stay in Wei City until Prince comes back. No matter what, we can't go to Feihong Pass and cause trouble for General Yuan, right?" Murong nodded and smiled, saying, "Marquis Nan is right." Reporting to Marquis Nan, General Murong. "There's an urgent message from 800 Li." At the bottom of the city tower, a soldier hurried up and handed over a sealed letter. Marquis Nan took it and opened it. He was overjoyed. Seeing his strange expression, Murong quickly asked, "Is there any good news from Prince's side?" Marquis Nan nodded and smiled, saying, "Yes, Prince has wiped out the Northern Tribes' army in Huifeng Valley. He killed the 7th Prince of the Northern Tribes and captured Helian Jin alive." Hearing this news, Murong was also very excited. Although they had now submitted to the Prince Ding mansion, they were still citizens of Chu state. Their hatred for the Northern Tribes was no less than anyone else's. Now that they heard the news that Prince Ding had wiped out the Northern Tribes' army, they could not help but feel relieved. Marquis Nan pulled Murong back and smiled, saying, "General, it's urgent. Prince will arrive in a few days. But before that, the news can't be leaked." Murong understood. He looked up and glanced at the West Hill barracks in the distance and smiled, saying, "Marquis Nan, don't worry. I promise that even a bird won't be able to fly over the top of the city walls." The two of them looked at each other and could not help but stand up and laugh. The soldiers guarding outside heard the laughter of the two commanders. Although they did not know why the two commanders were so happy, they could not help but feel relieved. In the West Hill barracks, Enchanting frowned and looked at the reports in front of him. He glanced at the generals below and asked in a low voice, "Is there any news from the Northern Tribes?" Enchanting stepped forward and said, "Father, there's been no news from the Northern Tribes in the past few days. Now that the North is bitterly cold, I'm afraid that the Mahist army and the Northern Tribes army are moving slowly. It is normal that there is no news." You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.